Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we explore the complete story of the Old Gods, the eldritch horrors that ruled Azeroth in its primordial age before the Titans came, imprisoning them beneath the earth where their whispers still corrupt the world today. To truly understand the Old Gods, we must first look beyond the boundaries of reality itself into a place called the Void. The Void is not merely darkness or emptiness. It is something far more terrifying, a realm that exists outside the borders of existence as we understand it. Within this incomprehensible expanse dwell beings of such immense power and alien nature that even the mightiest creatures of the physical universe cannot fully comprehend them. These are the Void Lords. The Void Lords are monstrous entities composed entirely of pure shadow energy. They are merciless, beyond mortal understanding, cruel in ways that transcend ordinary concepts of malevolence. Their desires are simple in their terrifying scope. They seek to twist all of reality into a realm of eternal torment, and ultimately to devour all matter and energy until nothing remains but that endless dark. The universe itself is their prey, and they have been hunting it since the moment of creation. From the instant the physical universe was born in the fires of the first light, the Void Lords watched with envious, hungry eyes. They observed the titans of the pantheon as those mighty beings traveled from world to world, shaping planets and nurturing life. The Titans possessed power that the Void Lords coveted, power drawn from order and creation itself. The Void Lords attempted to corrupt the Titans directly, to turn these world shapers to their service, but the Titans remained impervious to their efforts. Their connection to the primal forces of order made them resistant to the whispers from the dark. Frustrated but patient, beyond any mortal conception of time, the Void Lords devised a new plan. If they could not corrupt a fully formed Titan, perhaps they could reach one in its most vulnerable state. Throughout the great dark beyond, certain worlds contained something precious, slumbering world souls, nascent Titans that had not yet awakened to consciousness. These world souls were pure potential, vast beings of immense power that grew slowly within the hearts of their planets over millions of years. And in their sleep, they were vulnerable. The Void Lords pooled their essence and their power, reaching across the boundaries between their realm and physical reality. They created something terrible, something that would serve as their agents in the physical cosmos. These were the Old Gods, parasitic horrors designed to find and corrupt world souls before they could awaken. The Old Gods were not merely servants or weapons. They were extensions of the Void Lord's will, physical manifestations of the Void itself, given form and purpose. They were living corruption, entities whose very existence spread darkness and madness wherever they touched. The Void Lords hurled these dark creations out into the universe like seeds scattered by a farmer, hoping that some would land on fertile ground. They did not know which worlds contained world souls. They could not see clearly from their realm outside reality, so they cast their horrors widely, trusting that probability would favor them, that at least some of their creations would find what they sought. The Old Gods plummeted through the great dark beyond, masses of writhing darkness and corrupted flesh, seeking worlds to infest. The creation of the Old Gods required enormous sacrifice from the Void Lords. These entities could not maintain physical forms within the ordered universe for long. The very fabric of reality rejected their presence, burning away their essence like fire-consuming paper. To create the old gods, the Void Lords had to pour portions of themselves across the barrier between dimensions, enduring agony that would have destroyed lesser beings. But the potential reward was worth any sacrifice. A corrupted world soul would provide them with a champion capable of entering the physical universe and reshaping it according to their desires. Each old god was unique, shaped by the particular Void Lord or combination of Void Lords that had contributed to its creation. They shared common traits: the ability to corrupt and spread madness, the hunger to consume and dominate, the instinctive drive to seek out world souls. But each also had distinct characteristics, different approaches to achieving their shared goal. Some were creatures of overwhelming power, designed to crush all opposition through sheer force. Others were more subtle, built for infiltration and manipulation. This diversity was intentional, ensuring that regardless of what defenses a world might possess, at least some old gods would find ways to circumvent them. The journey through the great dark beyond was long even by cosmic standards. The old gods traveled for millennia, drifting through the void between stars, pulled by instincts they could not fully understand toward worlds that might contain their prey. Some fell into suns and were destroyed. Others landed on worlds with no world souls and could only spread corruption among whatever lesser life existed there. A few were intercepted by the Titans and destroyed before they could take root. But many found targets, embedded themselves in worlds across the universe, and began the slow work of corruption that their creators had designed them for. The old gods that fell were many, and they landed on countless worlds across the cosmos. Some found barren rocks with no world souls to corrupt. Others were destroyed by existing powers before they could take root. But some found exactly what they were looking for: worlds with slumbering titans within them, worlds ripe for corruption. And one such world would prove to be the most important of all. The world in question was young by cosmic standards, still cooling from its formation, still settling into the shape it would carry for eons to come. Deep within its molten core, something stirred. A consciousness was beginning to form, a world soul of unprecedented power growing slowly in the darkness beneath the surface. This nascent titan was the prize that the Void Lords sought, and the old gods would fight for millennia to claim it. The planet itself was a place of primal chaos. Elemental forces raged across its surface, fire and water and earth and air battling for dominance in endless conflict. There was no life as we would recognize it, no plants or animals or thinking beings. There was only the raw power of creation, shaping and reshaping the land in an eternal cycle of destruction and renewal. Into this primordial maelstrom, the old gods fell like dark stars. The impact of their arrival was felt across the entire planet. Mountains shattered, seas boiled, the sky itself seemed to crack as the old gods, massive forms, struck the surface. They were not small creatures, these parasites from beyond reality. Each was a mountain of flesh and darkness, a living corruption that spread tendrils in all directions the moment it touched solid ground. The land itself recoiled from their presence, but there was nowhere for it to flee. 4 old gods crashed into the primordial world that would one day be called Azeroth. They came from the great dark beyond, like meteors of corruption, slamming into the planet's surface with enough force to embed themselves deep within its crust. These were Y'Sharj, the strongest and most terrible of the four, S'thun, the eye of chaos whose gaze brought madness, Yogg-Saron, the god of death and the beast with 1,000 maws, and N'Zoth, the weakest but most cunning, the corrupter who worked through manipulation rather than force. Each old god landed in a different region of the ancient continent, and each immediately began to spread its influence. They were not subtle about their arrival. The very land around them began to change, twisting and corrupting under their touch. The sky darkened where they had fallen. The earth itself seemed to groan in pain as their tendrils burrowed deeper and deeper toward the planet's core, toward the sleeping world soul that they had been created to find. The transformation of the land around each old god was immediate and horrifying. Plants that had never existed before sprouted from soil touched by corruption, twisted vegetation that pulsed with dark energy and spread toxins through the air. Water sources became contaminated, their contents transforming into substances that induced madness in any creature that drank from them. The very stones began to shift and reform, taking on organic qualities as if the earth itself was being converted into flesh. The old gods communicated with each other through methods that defy mortal understanding. They shared no common language, for language as we understand it is a tool of ordered minds. Instead, they exchanged emotions, intentions, images of conquest and corruption. They knew that they had found what they sought, a world soul of unprecedented power, a prize worth any sacrifice. They also knew that they were competitors as much as allies, that each sought to be the one who finally delivered Azeroth's world soul to the Void Lords. In those early days, before the Black Empire had fully formed, the old gods tested each other's strength. S'thun's gaze swept across Y'Sharj's territory, probing for weaknesses. Yogg-Saron sent whispers into the dreams of N'Zoth's servants, trying to turn them against their master. N'Zoth, weakest of the four, watched from the shadows, learning from its siblings' conflicts and planning for the day when it might exploit their rivalries. These early skirmishes established the hierarchy that would persist throughout the age of the Black Empire, with Y'Sharj at the top and the others jockeying for position beneath. Y'Sharj was the first to establish its dominance, and it proved to be the mightiest of its siblings. This massive horror spread across the northwestern regions of the primordial continent, its form so vast that it seemed to swallow the landscape. Y'Sharj was a being of pure, overwhelming power, capable of crushing any resistance through sheer force. Its presence alone was enough to drive lesser beings mad, and its influence spread like a plague across the land. S'thun embedded itself in the southwestern regions, creating a network of corruption that stretched beneath the deserts and mountains. Unlike Y'Sharj's brute force, S'thun was more patient, more methodical. It was the eye that saw all, the presence that watched from the darkness. Its tentacles reached out in all directions, creating an intricate web of influence and control. Where S'thun looked, madness followed. Where its gaze lingered, reality itself began to unravel. Yogg-Saron took root in the far north of the continent, in regions that would one day become frozen wastelands. This old god was perhaps the most insidious of the four, for it worked through dreams and nightmares, through the manipulation of minds rather than the domination of bodies. Yogg-Saron whispered constantly, filling the world with its terrible voice. It called itself the God of Death, and the Beast with 1,000 Maws, and Hope's End. Each name was earned through acts of corruption and destruction. And Xal'atath was the last to establish itself, taking position in the eastern regions of the continent. Though considered the weakest of the four, Xal'atath possessed a cunning that its siblings lacked. While the others relied on force or fear, Xal'atath preferred manipulation. It worked through proxies and pawns, corrupting minds so subtly that its victims did not realize they had been turned until it was far too late. Xal'atath was patient, willing to wait ages for its schemes to bear fruit. As the old gods embedded themselves deeper and deeper into Azeroth's surface, organic matter began to seep from their massive forms. This was not mere biological waste, but corrupted essence, the physical manifestation of void energy-given substance. The process of creating servants was almost unconscious for the old gods, a natural byproduct of their existence rather than a deliberate act. Just as a fire produces smoke and heat, the old gods produced corruption and spawn. The first creatures to arise from this process were simple things, barely more intelligent than animals. They served as eyes and ears for their creators, scouting the territories between the old gods' domains and reporting on what they found. As the old gods' power grew, so did the sophistication of their spawn. The creatures became larger, stronger, more intelligent, until they were capable of complex tasks and independent decision-making. From this foul material arose the first servants of the old gods, creatures that would serve as their hands and eyes in the physical world. The first of these servant races were the Naraki, also known in later ages as the faceless ones. These monstrous beings were intelligent and powerful, tall creatures with no true faces, their forms suggesting nightmares made flesh. The Ahn'qiraj served as the taskmasters and generals of the old gods, enforcing their will and organizing their forces. They possessed powerful magic drawn from the void itself, and their presence could drive mortal beings to madness. The second servant race were the aqir, insectoid creatures of incredible resilience and strength. The aqir were less individually powerful than the Ahn'qiraj, but far more numerous. They reproduced quickly and served as the workers and soldiers of the old gods' burgeoning empire. The aqir built massive structures and fought endless wars at the command of their masters, their minds completely enslaved to the will of the entities that had birthed them. The aqir were designed for efficiency above all else. Their bodies could function in environments that would kill most other creatures: extreme heat, crushing pressure, toxic atmospheres. They required little food and no rest, working continuously until their bodies wore out. When an aqir died, others would consume its body, wasting nothing. They were the perfect workforce for entities that measured time in epochs and cared nothing for the comfort of their servants. The hives that the aqir built were engineering marvels, even by the standards of the Titan Forged, who would later study them. Underground complexes stretched for miles, their tunnels reinforced with materials that the aqir secreted from their own bodies. Ventilation systems maintained breathable air, even in the deepest chambers. Storage facilities preserved food and resources for centuries. Everything was designed with ruthless practicality, optimized for the expansion of the Black Empire. The aqir's military capabilities were equally impressive. They fought in swarms, overwhelming enemies with sheer numbers. Individual aqir were expendable, and they knew it. They would hurl themselves against defenses without hesitation, dying by the thousands to achieve objectives that served their master's will. Their commanders, the larger and more intelligent castes, coordinated these assaults with precision that belied the apparent chaos of their attacks. Perhaps most terrifying was the aqir's adaptability. When they encountered new challenges, new threats, new environments, they evolved to meet them. This evolution was not natural selection over generations, but directed modification within lifetimes. The old gods could reshape their aqir servants to meet specific needs, creating specialized castes for particular tasks. This made the aqir infinitely versatile, capable of adapting to any situation their masters might face. Among the Enraki arose beings of exceptional power, known as the Sithrax. These massive creatures were far larger and more resilient than ordinary faceless ones, serving as warlords and champions in the old gods' armies. The Sithrax led the aqir swarms into battle and commanded entire legions in the wars that were to come. Their names would echo through history: Zon-Oz, who served Enzoth; Kithix, who would later wage war against the trolls; Mithrax, who descended upon Zandalar in ancient times. With their servants multiplying and their influence spreading, the old gods began the task they had been created for. Their tendrils reached ever deeper toward Azeroth's core, seeking the world soul that slumbered there, and what they found exceeded even the Void Lord's darkest hopes. The world soul within Azeroth was immense, more powerful than any the Titans had ever discovered. If they could corrupt it before it awakened, they would create a dark titan of unimaginable power, a being that could annihilate the universe itself. The old gods' tendrils were not merely physical appendages. They were conduits of corruption, channels through which void energy could flow directly into the planet's heart. As they burrowed deeper, they left trails of darkness that poisoned everything they touched. Stone became blighted, water turned foul. The very essence of the land was twisted by their passage. The approach to the world soul was gradual by necessity. Even the old gods, for all their power, could not simply plunge directly to the planet's core. The pressure and heat of Azeroth's depths were formidable barriers. So they worked slowly, corrupting layer after layer of rock and magma, transforming hostile environments into extensions of their own flesh. Each inch of progress brought them closer to their goal. The world soul itself remained blissfully unaware of the threat. It was still forming, still developing the consciousness that would one day make it a titan. Its dreams were simple, primal things, reflections of the elemental forces that raged on the surface above. It did not know that creatures of pure malevolence were reaching toward it, did not understand that its very existence was the reason for the corruption spreading across its world. But the world soul's power was already beginning to affect the old gods. Proximity to such immense arcane energy accelerated their own growth, making them stronger and more terrible with each passing age. The power they sought to corrupt was also fueling their expansion, a bitter irony that would have profound consequences for Azeroth's future. The stronger the world soul grew, the stronger its would-be corruptors became. The old gods did not merely seek to corrupt Azeroth's world soul. They sought to dominate the entire planet, to transform it into a realm of darkness and madness that would serve as a monument to the void. To this end, they began constructing an empire unlike anything that had existed before or would exist again. This was the Black Empire, a civilization of horror and despair that covered the face of the world. The Naraki served as architects and overseers for this terrible construction project. Under their direction, the aqir built massive citadels and temple cities around the bulks of their old godmasters. These structures were not merely buildings, but extensions of the old gods themselves, constructed from materials infused with void energy and designed according to geometries that defied mortal comprehension. The greatest of these citadels rose around Y'Sharj, the mightiest of the old gods, a mountain of darkness that cast its shadow across the land. The architecture of the Black Empire served purposes that went beyond shelter or defense. Every structure was designed to amplify the old gods' influence, to serve as a conduit for void energy, to spread corruption across the land. The temples were not places of worship in any sense that mortal beings would understand. They were instruments, vast engines that drew power from the suffering and fear of those within and channeled it to the old gods themselves. The citadels were constructed from a substance that the Enraki secreted, a material that was neither entirely stone nor flesh, but something in between. This substance responded to the will of the old gods, shifting and reforming as needed. Walls could open to admit servants and close to trap enemies. Floors could become pits. Ceilings could descend to crush intruders. The buildings themselves were weapons, extensions of their creator's malevolence. At the center of each major citadel stood what the servants of the old gods called a heart chamber. These were spaces where the presence of the old god was strongest, where reality itself bent to accommodate entities that should not have been able to exist within the physical universe. Mortal beings who entered heart chambers rarely emerged with their sanity intact. Those who served the old gods viewed visits to these places as the highest honor, a chance to commune directly with their masters. The roads that connected the citadels were built with similar attention to dark purpose. They were not merely paths for travel, but channels for corruption, designed to spread the old god's influence into regions that had not yet fallen under direct control. Walking these roads exposed travelers to whispers and visions, gradual corruption that would claim them before they reached their destination. The roads themselves were weapons of conquest, softening up populations before the armies arrived. Each old god commanded its own domain within the Black Empire, and each domain reflected its master's nature. The lands controlled by Y'Sharj were places of overwhelming power and terror, where lesser beings were crushed under the weight of the old god's mere presence. The air itself seemed heavier in Y'Sharj's territory, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down upon all who entered. Its 7 heads represented different aspects of its power, each capable of acting independently while remaining part of the greater whole. Creatures that served Y'Sharj directly often became reflections of these aspects, embodying pride, anger, hatred, fear, despair, doubt, or violence. Sethun's territories were realms of paranoia and surveillance, where countless eyes watched from every shadow. The old god's physical form was dominated by a massive central eye, and this theme repeated throughout its domain. Eyes sprouted from walls and floors, blinked from the depths of pools, stared down from ceilings of living flesh. Nothing moved within Sethun's realm without being observed. The constant surveillance drove many servants mad, unable to escape the feeling that they were always being judged, always being found wanting. Those who pleased Chthun were rewarded with visions and knowledge. Those who failed simply ceased to exist, unmade by their god's terrible gaze. Yogg-Saron's dominion was a place of nightmares made manifest, where reality blurred, with dreams and sanity meant nothing. The beast with 1,000 maws earned its name from the countless mouths that covered its form, each one whispering different secrets, different lies, different truths. In Yogg-Saron's territory, servants never knew which whispers to trust. Some spoke prophecies that came true, others promised rewards that never materialized. Still others seemed to be warnings that made no sense until disaster had already struck. The psychological torment was constant, an environment designed to break minds and reshape them according to the old god's will. And Azoth's realm was a web of manipulation and corruption, where nothing was as it seemed, and trust was the most dangerous luxury. Unlike its siblings, Azoth did not display its power openly. Its servants were often unaware they were being used. Alliances formed and broke according to plans they could not perceive. Enemies became friends, and friends became enemies, with no apparent cause, guided by Azoth's invisible hand. The old god's domain was a laboratory for testing techniques of subversion that would later be applied to greater targets. But the old gods were not the only powerful beings on primordial Azeroth. Before their arrival, the planet had been home to spirits of immense power, beings that embodied the elemental forces of fire, water, earth, and air. These were the elemental lords, and they had ruled Azeroth in endless chaotic warfare since the planet's formation. Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, commanded all flames and molten fury. Therazane, the Stone Mother, embodied the solid earth and the mountains. Aqir, the Wind Lord, controlled the skies and all that moved upon them. And Neptulon, the Tide Hunter, was master of the seas and all waters. When the old gods arrived and began building their empire, the elemental lords saw them as a threat to their dominion. For the first time in Azeroth's history, the four elemental powers set aside their eternal conflicts and united against a common enemy. They marshaled their forces and launched war against the Black Empire, bringing the full fury of the elements against the servants of the old gods. The war was devastating. Aqir and Ragnaros cooperated to create blistering firestorms that reduced entire citadels of the Black Empire to ash. Therazane raised jagged walls of stone to corral the Enraki and Aqir, then shattered them along with her enemies. Neptulon crushed swarms of faceless ones beneath waves the size of mountains. The elements raged across the face of Azeroth, and for a time it seemed that they might succeed in driving back the invaders. The elemental lords were ancient beyond measure, having existed since Azeroth itself had formed. They had weathered countless conflicts against each other, their power waxing and waning as territories changed hands and alliances shifted. But they had never faced anything like the old gods. The cosmic horrors from beyond reality did not fight according to any rules the elementals understood. They did not seek territory or dominion in the way the elemental lords did. They sought absolute corruption, the transformation of everything into extensions of themselves. The battles of this primordial war reshaped the very surface of Azeroth. Volcanoes erupted where Ragnaros clashed with aqir swarms, leaving behind mountain ranges that still smoke today. Inland seas formed and evaporated as Neptulon deployed his waters against the citadels of the Black Empire. Entire continents shifted position under the pressure of Therazane's earth magic. Al-Aqir's storms scoured landscapes bare, erasing any evidence that the Black Empire had ever built there. The old gods responded to the elemental assault with characteristic patience and cunning. They recognized that the elemental lords, for all their power, were beings of physical reality rather than void entities. This made them vulnerable to corruption in ways that the old gods themselves were not. Instead of simply trying to destroy the elementals through force, the old gods began working to subvert them. Whispers reached the elemental lords, promises of power and alliance, suggestions that their true enemies were not the old gods but each other. The ancient rivalries between fire and water, earth and air, were inflamed by careful manipulation. The unity that had allowed the elementals to mount an effective resistance began to fracture. Old grudges resurfaced, accusations flew. The alliance that had threatened the Black Empire started to tear itself apart from within. But the old gods possessed advantages that the elementals could not overcome. No matter how many Enraki and Aqir were destroyed, more and more spawned from the putrid flesh of their masters. The old gods' servants were essentially unlimited, while the elementals' forces, though powerful, were finite. Slowly, inevitably, the tide of battles turned. One by one, the elemental lords fell before the endless swarms. When the elementals were finally defeated, the old gods did not destroy them. Instead, they enslaved them, binding the elemental lords to their will through chains of dark magic. Ragnaros, Therazane, Al-Aqir, and Neptulon became servants of the Black Empire, their tremendous powers now directed by the will of the old gods. With the elementals under their control, the old gods' dominion over Azeroth seemed complete. The enslaved elemental lords were put to work reshaping the world according to their new master's desires. Ragnaros was forced to heat forges where the aqir crafted weapons of war. Therazane was compelled to raise new mountains that would serve as fortresses for the Enraki. Al-Aqir's winds carried the whispers of the old gods across the entire continent. Neptulon's waters filled the moats and channels that protected the Black Empire's greatest citadels. Each use of their power was a humiliation, a reminder of their defeat and subjugation. The elemental lords harbored a burning hatred for their captors, but they could not resist the chains that bound them. The old god's magic was stronger than elemental will, stronger than elemental pride. Ragnaros, who had never knelt to anyone, was forced to bow. Al-Aqir, who had once ruled the skies unchallenged, was reduced to a messenger. Therazane, whose patience was legendary even among immortals, seethed with a rage that would persist for millions of years. Only Neptulon seemed to maintain some measure of composure, hiding his fury beneath the placid surface of deep waters. The elementals would eventually be freed when the Titans arrived, banished to their own plane rather than remaining as servants of the old gods. But they never forgot their time in bondage. Even in the modern era, the elemental lords view the old gods with a hatred that transcends ordinary enmity. It is a hatred born of shame and powerlessness, of being forced to serve creatures they despised with every fiber of their being. Yet even in victory, the old gods were not united. They were creatures of the void, and the void knows no loyalty or cooperation. Each old god sought to dominate the others, to become the sole master of Azeroth and the world soul within it. The Black Empire was riven by constant internal conflict, with the forces of each old god battling against those of its siblings. The most intense of these conflicts involved Xal'atath, whose eastern domain bordered on the territories of all three of its siblings. The forces of Xal'atath, led by the Sithraxi warlord Zon-Oz, waged endless wars against the armies of S'thun and Yogg-Saron. At one point, Xal'atath even challenged Y'Sharj itself, leading a massive assault against the mightiest old god in the land that would one day be called the Broken Shore. Xal'atath lost that battle, a defeat that reminded all of Y'Sharj's supremacy among the four. These internal conflicts weakened the Black Empire, but never threatened its existence. The old gods were immortal and infinitely patient. They could afford to wage war against each other for millennia while still working toward their ultimate goal. The world soul of Azeroth continued to grow, and the old god's corruption continued to spread toward it. In time, they would corrupt it completely, and then their petty sibling rivalries would no longer matter. A dark titan would rise, and all of reality would fall. The internal wars of the Black Empire produced champions and villains whose names echoed through the ages. Sithrax warlords led armies numbering in the millions against each other, battling for territory and for the favor of their respective old gods. The ahn'qiraj developed elaborate systems of rank and precedence, with promotion coming through assassination and betrayal as often as through victory in battle. The aqir evolved new castes to meet the demands of different old gods, creating variations that would eventually become the distinct races of Qiraji, Nerubians, and Montids. Religious practices also diverged between the old gods' domains. Each demanded worship in different forms. Y'Sharj was honored through displays of strength and dominance, through the subjugation of the weak by the strong. S'thun required constant offerings of blood and pain, feeding on the suffering of sacrifices who were kept alive for as long as possible. Yogg-Saron accepted worship through the sharing of nightmares and madness, with its most devoted followers driving others insane as proof of their faith. Xal'atath accepted more subtle offerings, secrets whispered in the dark, betrayals that weakened rivals, corruptions that spread without detection. The culture of the Black Empire, if it could be called that, was one of unrelenting horror. There was no art except in the glorification of the old gods. There was no music except the screams of victims and the chanting of rituals. There was no love, no friendship, no loyalty except that enforced by fear. Every creature in the Black Empire existed solely to serve the will of its master, and that service demanded everything. To live under the rule of the old gods was to exist in endless torment, with no hope of escape and no possibility of mercy. And yet the Black Empire endured for countless millennia, its horror sustained by the infinite patience of its rulers. The old gods had no need for their servants to be happy or willing. They required only obedience, and the chains they had forged could not be broken by any creature that walked Azeroth's surface. The Black Empire would stand forever, or so it seemed, until beings greater than any the world had ever known finally turned their attention to the infected planet. But the old gods' plans did not account for what was coming. Far across the great dark beyond, the titans of the Pantheon had noticed something unusual about a small blue world. They sensed the presence of a world soul within it, a world soul of unprecedented power and potential, and they set course to investigate, not knowing the horrors that awaited them. The Titans of the Pantheon were beings of unimaginable power, cosmic entities born from the world souls of planets, just as the potential within Azeroth might one day be born. They traveled the great dark beyond in their endless quest to find and nurture world souls, to bring order to chaos, and to protect the nascent titans that slumbered within certain worlds. The pantheon consisted of the mightiest titans, each embodying different aspects of creation and order. Aman'Thul, the Highfather, led the pantheon. He was a being of wisdom and foresight, ancient beyond measure and powerful beyond comprehension. Sargeras, before his fall, served as the pantheon's greatest warrior and defender. Ionar the Lifebinder nurtured life wherever she found it. Norgannon the Dreamweaver preserved knowledge and magic. Khaz'goroth, the Shaper, crafted worlds and blessed those who built great works. Agramar was the Titan champion who fought alongside Sargeras, and Golganath the Thunderer commanded storms and the skies. When the Pantheon drew close to Azeroth, they immediately sensed two things. The first was the World Soul, which was unlike any they had ever encountered. Its power dwarfed that of other World Souls they had discovered, suggesting that the Titan within would one day be mightier than any member of the Pantheon itself. The second thing they sensed was wrong. The planet was sick, infected by something dark and terrible that had burrowed deep into its surface. The Titans knew immediately what had happened. They recognized the taint of the void, the corruption of the old gods. These parasitic entities were known to them, threats they had encountered on other worlds. But never had they seen an infection this severe. Never had they found old gods so deeply embedded in a world soul this precious. The situation was dire. If the old gods succeeded in corrupting Azeroth's world soul, the resulting Dark Titan would be powerful enough to threaten the Pantheon itself, perhaps even to destroy the universe. The Titans could not intervene directly. Their physical forms were so immense that any direct action they took on Azeroth's surface would cause catastrophic damage to the planet and potentially harm the world soul they sought to protect. Instead, they decided to create armies that could fight in their stead, beings powerful enough to challenge the forces of the Black Empire, but small enough to operate without destroying the world. The Pantheon infused great amounts of their power into the surface of Azeroth, and from this power arose the Titan Forged. These were beings of living stone and metal, crafted in the image of the Titans, but scaled to operate on a mortal world. The mightiest of the Titan Forged were the Keepers, godlike beings who would serve as the Titan's hands and voices. Beneath the Keepers were the Titan-forged armies, the Earthen, the Mechagnomes, the Mogu, and many others. The Keepers were among the most powerful beings ever to walk Azeroth's surface. Odin was the prime designate, the Titan-forged who served as overall commander of their forces. Thorim commanded storms and led the armies in battle. Hodir embodied the cold of winter and was a devastating warrior. Freya nurtured life and fought to protect the natural world. Mimiron was a genius of invention and construction. Tyr was a champion of justice and order. And Loken, though he would later fall to corruption, was initially a wise counselor and powerful mage. When the Titan-forged armies marched against the Black Empire, the old gods responded by unleashing their enslaved elementals. The elemental lords were forced to fight against the servants of order, their tremendous powers directed by their dark masters. But the Titan Forged had been specifically designed to combat such threats. They fought through the elemental onslaught, driving back fire and water, earth and air. The war that followed was the most devastating conflict Azeroth had ever known. The Titan-forged shattered citadels of the Black Empire, cut through swarms of Naraki and Aqir, and faced down the elemental lords themselves. One by one, the elemental powers were defeated. Without the old gods to bind them to the physical world, they were banished to an abyssal plane that would later be called the Elemental Plane, a prison dimension where they would battle each other for eternity. The battles themselves were unlike anything Azeroth had experienced. The Titan-forged advanced in disciplined formations, their bodies of living stone and metal resistant to the corruption that had claimed so many before them. Odin led from the front, his spear piercing the hides of Naraki generals, while his voice rallied the earthen legions. Thorim called down lightning that shattered entire citadels, while Hodor's frost froze aqir swarms solid before they could overwhelm defensive positions. Tyr, the Hand of Justice, proved essential in the conflicts against the Seathrax warlords. His silver hand, which would later be lost in a battle against the proto-dragon Galakrond, was at this time a weapon of tremendous power. Tyr faced down the greatest of the old gods' champions in single combat, his courage inspiring the Titan-forged armies to fight on even when the situation seemed hopeless. Freya used her power over life to create sanctuaries where wounded Titan-forged could recover, spaces where the old gods' corruption could not reach. She also cultivated the natural world, working to heal the damage that the Black Empire had inflicted and preparing Azeroth for the peace that would hopefully follow the war. Her work would eventually result in the creation of the Emerald Dream, a blueprint of what Azeroth could become if freed from corruption. Mimiron contributed weapons and devices of incredible sophistication, creations that could pierce the defenses of the old gods' most heavily fortified positions. His inventions were often unpredictable and occasionally dangerous to their users, but they provided capabilities that would have been impossible to develop otherwise. Many of the Titan facilities that still exist today were constructed using techniques that Mimiron developed during this ancient war. The war lasted for millennia, a span of time almost incomprehensible to mortal minds. Entire generations of the old gods' servants were born, fought, and died while the conflict raged. Mountains were raised and leveled, seas formed and evaporated. The very geography of Azeroth was reshaped by the forces being deployed on both sides. It was a war of attrition on a cosmic scale, with neither side willing to surrender and neither side able to achieve decisive victory. With the elementals gone, the Titan-forged turned their full attention to the old gods themselves. N'Zoth was the first to be defeated and imprisoned, locked away in a Titan-wrought prison deep beneath the earth. The campaign against N'Zoth was notable for the old god's cunning rather than its power. It tried to corrupt the Titan-forged who faced it, whispering promises of power and glory into minds that had been designed to resist such temptations. When these tactics failed, N'Zoth attempted to flee, but there was nowhere on Azeroth where the Titan-forged could not follow. Eventually, The weakest of the old gods was cornered and sealed away, its prison designed to contain its whispers as well as its physical form. S'thun followed, contained in what would later become the fortress of ahn'qiraj. The battle against S'thun was harder, for this old god possessed tremendous physical power in addition to its mental abilities. Its eye could project beams of destructive energy that vaporized Titan forged by the hundreds. Its tentacles were so numerous that they seemed to cover the entire battlefield. The keeper Sethris led the assault against S'thun, using techniques developed specifically to counter the old god's gaze. Even so, the casualties were immense, and the victory came only after sacrifices that would be remembered for ages. Yogg-Saron proved cunning even in defeat, but through trickery and strategy, the Titan Forged managed to imprison it within the depths of their fortress of Ulduar. The beast with 1,000 maws did not fight like its siblings. Instead, it attempted to turn the Titan Forged against each other, to corrupt them from within rather than defeat them from without. It nearly succeeded when it managed to plant seeds of doubt in Loken's mind, seeds that would eventually bear terrible fruit. But for the moment, the Titan Forged's unity held, and Yogg-Saron was sealed away in a prison of unprecedented complexity. But Y'Shaarj remained. The mightiest of the old gods refused to fall before the Titan-forged armies. No matter what strategies they employed, no matter how many forces they brought to bear, they could not defeat Y'Shaarj. The old god's power was simply too great. Its citadel remained standing while its siblings' fortresses crumbled. Its servants continued to fight while the other armies scattered. It seemed that Y'Shaarj would resist even the full might of the Titan Forged. Watching from beyond the sky, the Pantheon grew concerned. Y'Shaarj was far more powerful than they had anticipated. The Titan Forged, for all their might, could not defeat this ancient horror. If Y'Shaarj was allowed to continue its work unchecked, it might succeed in corrupting the world soul, even with its siblings imprisoned. The Pantheon faced a terrible choice: intervene directly and risk damaging the planet, or allow the old god to potentially achieve its goal. Aman'Thul, the High Father, made the decision. He would take action himself. Reaching down from the heavens with his massive hand, Aman'Thul seized Y'Shaarj and ripped the old god from the surface of Azeroth. It was an act of tremendous power, a titan, physically tearing out an entity that had embedded itself deep within a world's crust. Y'Shaarj was torn apart by the force, its body breaking as Aman'Thul pulled it free. But in removing Y'Shaarj, Aman'Thul caused exactly the damage the Pantheon had feared. The old god had buried itself so deeply into Azeroth that its removal tore open a massive wound in the planet's surface. From this wound, arcane energy began to hemorrhage, the lifeblood of the world soul itself pouring out into the world. The Titans watched in horror as the precious essence they had sought to protect spilled forth from the gaping hole. The wound would never fully heal. Over time, it would fill with water and become the well of eternity, a lake of pure, arcane power that would shape the fate of Azeroth for millennia to come. But in that moment, the Titans faced the terrible realization that they could not simply remove the old gods without destroying the planet. The remaining three had embedded themselves too deeply. Removing them would kill Azeroth and the world soul within it. The Well of Eternity would become one of the most significant locations in Azeroth's history. Its waters contained pure, arcane energy, the very essence of the world soul made manifest. Creatures that drank from its waters or bathed in its light gained magical abilities beyond their natural capacities. Over time, races would evolve near the well, transformed by its power into something greater than they might otherwise have become. The dark trolls who settled near the well were among the first to feel its influence. Exposure to its energies changed them over thousands of years, their skin darkening to a deep purple hue, their bodies becoming taller and more graceful. They developed an innate connection to magic that set them apart from all other mortal races. They called themselves Kaldore, the children of the stars, though history would remember them as night elves. The night elves built their civilization around the Well of Eternity, drawing upon its power for everything from illumination to construction to warfare. They became the dominant power on ancient Kalimdor, their empire spanning the entire continent. But their reliance on the well made them vulnerable to its influence, and that influence was not entirely benign. The well remembered where its power had come from. It remembered the wound that had created it, and through that wound, the whispers of dead Y'Sharj could still occasionally be heard. The Highborn, the night elven nobility who worked most closely with the well, gradually became addicted to its power. They sought ever greater magical heights, ever more elaborate displays of arcane ability. Their queen, Ashara, was the most powerful mage of her age, and she was never satisfied with what she had. She wanted more, always more. This hunger would eventually lead her to reach out across the cosmos, seeking sources of power beyond what the well could provide. What she found would nearly destroy the world. Y'Sharj was dead, but its death came at a terrible cost. The Titans could not kill the remaining old gods without sacrificing everything they sought to protect. Instead, they would have to find another way, a method to contain the corruption without destroying its source. The Pantheon ordered the Titan Forged to imprison the remaining old gods rather than destroy them, sealing them away in Titan-wrought facilities designed to hold them for eternity. But even in death, Y'Sharj's influence would continue. As the old god died, torn apart by the High Father's hand, it released one final gasp, a last expression of its terrible power. This dying breath did not simply dissipate. Instead, it manifested as 7 distinct entities, beings of pure negative emotion that would become known as the Shah. These manifestations embodied the darkest aspects of mortal feeling: anger, hatred, violence, fear, doubt, despair, and pride. The Shah sank into the land where Y'Sharj had been rooted, the region that would one day become Pandaria. There they would lurk for tens of thousands of years, feeding on negative emotions and waiting for opportunities to manifest. They were not alive in the conventional sense, but neither were they truly dead. They were echoes of Y'Sharj, fragments of the old god's essence that retained some measure of its power. The Titans also discovered something else in the ruins of Y'Sharj's domain: the heart. Even after the old god's body had been destroyed, its heart continued to beat, still infused with void energy and corrupted power. The Keeper Ra took custody of this terrible artifact, sealing it in a vault beneath the land where Y'Sharj had fallen. Ra hoped that studying the heart would help the Titan Forged understand the old gods and the void better, never imagining the horrors it would one day unleash. With Y'Sharj dead and its siblings imprisoned, the Titans began the process of ordering Azeroth. They healed what damage they could, shaped the continents, and established safeguards to prevent the old gods from ever breaking free. The keepers were assigned to watch over the prisons, each one tasked with maintaining the containment of a different old god. Facilities like Ulduar in the north and ahn'qiraj in the south were transformed into fortresses designed to hold their terrible prisoners forever. The Pantheon departed Azeroth, satisfied that they had done everything possible to protect the world soul. They left the keepers in charge, trusting their creations to maintain the prisons and continue the work of ordering the world. They did not know that the old gods were patient beyond imagining, that imprisonment was merely a setback rather than a defeat, and that the corruption they had fought so hard to contain would continue to spread through means they had not anticipated. Before their departure, the Titans established additional safeguards. They created the Forge of Origination, a device of tremendous power designed as a last resort. If the old gods ever broke free and their corruption threatened to consume the world soul, the Forge could be activated to purge all life from Azeroth's surface, creating a blank slate upon which new life could eventually emerge. The Titans hoped this weapon would never need to be used, but they were pragmatic enough to prepare for the worst. They also established the Tribunal of Ages, a repository of knowledge about Azeroth's history and the threats it faced. This facility would preserve records of the old gods and the Black Empire, ensuring that future generations would understand the dangers they might face. The Titans hoped that knowledge would prove as valuable as force in the eternal struggle against corruption. Perhaps most importantly, the Titans blessed the dragon aspects, 5 mighty dragons who would serve as guardians of Azeroth in the Pantheon's absence. Alexstrasza, the Lifebinder, would protect all living things. Nosdormu, the Timeless One, would watch over the Timeways. Ysera, she of the Dreaming, would guard the Emerald Dream. Neltharion, the Earth Warder, would watch over the deep places of the world. And Malygos, the Spellweaver, would safeguard all magic. Together, these 5 were meant to be the first line of defense against any threat, including the eventual return of the old gods. The irony of this arrangement would become apparent millennia later. The very dragons, meant to protect Azeroth from the old gods, would themselves become targets of corruption. Neltharion, given dominion over the earth where the old gods were imprisoned, was perfectly positioned for N'Zoth to whisper into his mind. The Titan Forged who watched over the prisons would be manipulated by the prisoners they guarded. Every safeguard the Titans established contained the seed of its own corruption. The centuries that followed the Pantheon's departure were a time of ordering and creation. The keepers worked tirelessly to heal the wounds that the Black Empire had inflicted upon the land. They created new races to help with this work, beings like the Earthen and the Mechagnomes who would maintain the Titan facilities and keep watch over the sleeping world. They established systems of governance and protection designed to ensure that the old gods would remain imprisoned forever. But even as the keepers built their ordered world, the old gods plotted. They could not break their physical chains, could not shatter the walls of their prisons through direct action, but they had other ways of reaching beyond their confinement. They had their whispers, their dreams, their ability to corrupt minds across vast distances, and they had time, endless time to work their slow corruption upon any weakness they could find. The keepers themselves were not immune to this threat. They were powerful, yes, but they were also isolated, cut off from the pantheon, responsible for maintaining vast facilities and watching over terrible prisoners. They faced challenges that would wear down even the strongest will. The old gods sensed this, and they began to probe, searching for vulnerabilities, testing defenses, looking for any crack through which they might drive a wedge. The physical prisons were strong, the magical wards were potent, but the keepers were individuals, each with their own personalities, their own desires, their own weaknesses. And it was through these weaknesses that the old gods would eventually begin their long campaign of subversion. Of all the imprisoned old gods, Yogg-Saron proved the most dangerous, even in captivity. The beast with 1,000 maws, the god of death, the fiend of 1,000 faces. These were just some of the names given to this terrible entity, and each name was earned through acts of corruption and manipulation that continued long after its imprisonment. Yogg-Saron was sealed within the depths of Ulduar, the fortress that the Titans had built in the far north of Azeroth. 6 keepers were assigned to watch over the prison: Loken, Thorim, Hodir, Tyr, Mimiron, and Freya. Each was a being of tremendous power, and together they should have been more than capable of containing even an old god. But Yogg-Saron did not fight against its chains with force. It fought with whispers. From its prison, Yogg-Saron reached out with tendrils of influence that were not physical but psychic. It could not break free, but it could speak. Its whispers penetrated the walls of Ulduar, reaching the minds of those who dwelt within. At first, the keepers resisted. They were Titan-forged, beings of order designed to withstand the corruption of the void. But Yogg-Saron was patient, and its whispers never stopped. Over time, Yogg-Saron's blood began to seep through the stone of its prison. This blood was not ordinary ichor, but something far more terrible, a substance so saturated with the old god's essence that it eventually hardened into a metallic ore. The native peoples of Northrend would one day call this ore Saronite, naming it after the entity from which it came. They warned any who would listen to stay away from it, to avoid contact with the black blood of Yogg-Saron. Saronite was evil in material form. Anyone who worked with it, mined it, or even spent too much time near it would hear Yogg-Saron's whispers. The old god's influence spread through its blood, reaching far beyond the walls of its prison. In later ages, the Scourge would use Saronite extensively in their weapons, armor, and fortifications. The entire ice-crowned citadel was constructed from Saronite, and the slaves forced to mine it were driven mad by the constant whispers in their minds. But Yogg-Saron's greatest achievement during its imprisonment was the corruption of Keeper Loken. This Titan-forged had been one of the wisest and most powerful of the Keepers, but he harbored a secret weakness: his love for Sif, the wife of his brother Thorim. Yogg-Saron sensed this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly, whispering temptations and fears into Loken's mind over countless years. The old god's whispers made Loken increasingly paranoid and possessive. It planted thoughts in his mind, suggestions that grew more compelling with each passing century. Finally, during a moment of heightened emotion, Loken lashed out at Sif. Whether by accident or design, his attack killed her. Horrified by what he had done, Loken knew he could not tell Thorim the truth. In his desperation, he turned to the only entity willing to help him hide his crime, Yogg-Saron. The old god guided Loken in creating an elaborate deception. They framed Arngrim, the king of the frost giants, for Sif's murder. When Thorim learned of his wife's death and the apparent perpetrator, his rage was terrible. He launched a devastating war against the frost giants, killing Arngrim and countless others in his quest for vengeance. The other keepers were drawn into the conflict, their attention diverted from their true duty of watching over Yogg-Saron. With Loken fully in its thrall, Yogg-Saron implemented its most devastating scheme, the Curse of Flesh. Using its influence over the corrupted keeper, the old god infected the Forge of Wills, one of the great Titan devices that the keepers used to create new Titan Forged. The curse was subtle, not immediately apparent, but its effects were profound. Titan Forged, created after the curse was implemented, would slowly transform over generations, their bodies of stone and metal gradually becoming flesh and blood. The Curse of Flesh represented a fundamental understanding of how corruption works. Yogg-Saron knew that direct assaults on the Titan Forged were doomed to fail. These beings had been specifically designed to resist void corruption. Their minds were fortified against whispers, their bodies immune to many forms of magical manipulation. But if those bodies could be changed, if the very nature of the Titan Forged could be altered, then resistance would crumble. The curse worked through the Forge of Wills because that device was the source of all new Titan Forged. By corrupting the source, Yogg-Saron ensured that every future generation would carry the seeds of its own transformation. Parents who were strong stone would give birth to children who were slightly softer. Those children would have children who were softer still. The process would take millennia, but Yogg-Saron had nothing but time. Loken maintained the curse in secret, using his position as one of the most trusted keepers to prevent its discovery. He sabotaged investigations that came close to the truth. He eliminated those who suspected something was wrong. He manipulated his fellow keepers into conflicts and distractions that kept them from focusing on their true purpose. All the while, Yogg-Saron whispered to him, guiding his actions and deepening his corruption. The other keepers eventually discovered Loken's betrayal, but by then it was too late. The Curse of Flesh had spread too far to be reversed. The transformation of the Titan-forged races was inevitable, a slow catastrophe that would unfold over ages. Loken was defeated, eventually, killed by adventurers who stormed Uldur during the war against the Lich King. But his greatest crime lived on in every mortal creature that walked Azeroth's surface. The Curse of Flesh was designed to facilitate assimilation. Creatures of flesh were more susceptible to the void's corruption than beings of living stone. By transforming the Titan Forged into mortal creatures, Yogg-Saron was weakening the defenses the Titans had established to contain it. Over time, the Earthen became dwarves, the Mechagnomes became gnomes. The Vrykul gave rise to humans. Each of these new races was mortal, vulnerable, and far easier to corrupt than their Titan-forged ancestors. The curse also spread to Titan-forged who had been created before its implementation. The transformation was slow, taking thousands of years, but it was inevitable. Throughout Azeroth, the servants of the Titans began to change, to weaken, to become something less than what they had been designed to be. And in their weakness, Yogg-Saron saw opportunity. The effects of the curse of flesh were far-reaching and profound. The earthen, beings of living stone who had been created to shape the world, began to develop soft tissue and biological organs. Their connection to the stone weakened. Their memories, once as permanent as the mountains, became fallible and fleeting. Over generations, they became dwarves, creatures of flesh and blood who had forgotten their origins and their purpose. The mechagnomes underwent a similar transformation, their bodies of metal and gears slowly becoming organic. The gnomes who resulted from this curse retained their ancestors' brilliance for engineering, but they were now mortal, vulnerable, limited in ways that living machines could never be. They no longer possessed the ability to interface directly with Titan machinery. They had to learn and remember rather than simply knowing. The Vrikul, powerful beings who had served as warriors for the Titan-forged armies, were perhaps the most dramatically affected. When the curse began to transform their children into smaller, weaker creatures, the Vrikul were horrified. Many killed these deformed offspring rather than allow them to live. But some parents could not bring themselves to slay their own children. They hid them away, allowed them to grow, and watched as these small Vrikul multiplied and spread. In time, these cursed offspring would become known as humans. The Mogu of Pandaria retained their stone forms longer than most, but even they eventually succumbed. When the curse of flesh finally claimed them, the Mogi became creatures of anger and cruelty. The orderly servants of the Titans transformed into brutal tyrants who enslaved the other races of Pandaria. Without the Titan-forged mental conditioning that had guided their behavior, the Mogu gave in to their worst impulses. Each transformation served Yogg-Saron's purpose. Mortal creatures were susceptible to fear, to despair, to the whispers that the old god could send into their dreams. They could be corrupted in ways that beings of living stone could not. The curse of flesh was perhaps the most successful of all old god schemes, weakening Azeroth's defenses without any of the defenders realizing what was being done to them. In the modern age, adventurers would eventually storm the halls of Ulduar and confront Yogg-Saron directly. The battle was unlike any they had faced before, taking place partially in the physical world and partially in the realm of the old god's mind. Champions who entered the chamber saw visions of history twisted by Yogg-Saron's perspective. The creation of the dragon soul, the assassination of King Lane, the torture of Bolvar Fordragon. Each vision was a reminder that the old god had been watching, manipulating, influencing events across millennia. The adventurers managed to defeat Yogg-Saron, but they could not kill it. The old god's essence was too deeply embedded in Azeroth to be destroyed without catastrophic damage to the planet itself. Instead, the weakened entity was sealed once more, its prison reinforced, its power diminished but not extinguished. Yogg-Saron remains within Ulduar to this day, its whispers quieter than before, but never entirely silent. The battle against Yogg-Saron revealed something important about the nature of the old gods and their connection to Azeroth. During the fight, champions witnessed visions of events from across history, the creation of the Dragon Soul, the assassination of King Lane Rin by Garona Halforsen, the torture of Bolvar Fordragon in Icecrown Citadel. These were not random images, but carefully selected moments, demonstrations of Yogg-Saron's influence upon the world, even from within its prison. The Dragon Soul vision was particularly significant. It showed that the old gods had played a role in one of the most devastating artifacts ever created, an artifact that would later be wielded by Deathwing in his attempt to destroy the world. The assassination of Lane demonstrated their reach into political affairs, their ability to manipulate events through agents and pawns. And the torture of Bolvar showed their interest in the powers of undeath, in the corruption of champions who might otherwise oppose them. These visions were also warnings. Yogg-Saron was showing its enemies that it had seen everything, had influenced everything, had been working toward goals that spanned millennia. The old god wanted those who defeated it to know that their victory was hollow, that the corruption it had spread could never be fully undone. It was an act of psychological warfare, a final strike against the minds of those who had dared to challenge the beast with 1,000 maws. The aftermath of the Ulduar campaign brought changes to the Titan facility. New wards were established, new guardians put in place. The surviving keepers, those who had not been corrupted or killed, worked to repair the damage that Yogg-Saron had caused. But they could not erase the old god's influence entirely. The curse of flesh continued to spread. The Saronite continued to whisper, and Yogg-Saron itself, though weakened, continued to dream its terrible dreams in the depths of its prison. While Yogg-Saron worked its corruption from beneath Ulduar, its sibling C'Thun stirred in its own prison to the south. The old god had been sealed beneath the deserts of what would become Kalimdor, its prison eventually incorporated into the fortress of ahn'qiraj. But prisons, no matter how well constructed, can be breached, and C'Thun had servants working tirelessly for its freedom. After the Black Empire fell, the aqir who had served C'Thun scattered across Azeroth. Some traveled north and would eventually become the Nerubians. Others traveled south to Pandaria and became the Mantid, but a significant portion remained near C'Thun's prison, evolving over time into a new form, the Qiraji. These insectoid creatures retained their devotion to the old god who had created their ancestors, and they labored endlessly to break the seals that held their master captive. The Qiraji built a vast civilization within ahn'qiraj, transforming the Titan prison into a temple city dedicated to C'Thun's worship. They developed a caste system with specialized breeds for different tasks: workers, warriors, prophets, and generals. At the top of their hierarchy were the twin emperors, Vek'nilash and Veklor, who ruled in C'Thun's name and directed all efforts toward the old god's eventual release. For millennia, the Qiraji remained hidden beneath the desert sands, expanding their tunnels and strengthening their armies. They had no contact with the surface world, content to serve their god in darkness. But everything changed when a night elf druid named Fandral Staghelm led an expedition into the southern deserts of Kalimdor around 1,000 years before the opening of the Dark Portal. Fandral and his druids were not looking for ancient horrors. They sought to transform the desert into a lush forest, extending the reach of nature into barren lands. What they found instead were the ruins of ahn'qiraj and the Qiraji who dwelt within. The presence of warm-blooded life in their halls roused the insectoids from their long preparation. Deep beneath the surface, C'Thun also sensed the intruders and stirred from its own dormancy. The old god's awakening was not complete, but it was enough. C'Thun sent its will into the Qiraji, commanding them to rise and conquer. The insectoids poured from their tunnels in numbers that defied comprehension, a tide of chitin and blades that swept across the desert like a living sandstorm. This was the beginning of the War of the Shifting Sands, a conflict that would nearly exterminate the Night Elves of southern Kalimdor. Fandral Stoghelm rallied the Night Elf armies against the Qiraji threat, but the insectoids' numbers were overwhelming. Battle after battle, the Night Elves were pushed back. They retreated through Ungoro Crater to the borders of the Tanaris Desert, losing ground with each engagement. The Qiraji showed no mercy, slaughtering any living being they encountered and expanding their territory with terrifying speed. The war became personal for Fandral when his son, Valstan Stoghelm, was captured during a particularly brutal engagement. The young druid had been leading a counterattack against the Qiraji vanguard when he was overwhelmed by superior numbers. His forces were slaughtered around him, and Valstan himself was dragged away toward the heart of ahn'qiraj. Fandral became obsessed with rescuing his son. He launched increasingly reckless assaults against the Qiraji lines, sacrificing soldiers in desperate attempts to push toward where Valstan was being held. Each assault failed. Each failure cost more lives. The Night Elf generals began to question whether their leader was still fit to command. The Qiraji knew exactly what they were doing. They sent Fandral visions of his son being tortured, images designed to drive the archdruid mad with fury and grief. They taunted him with glimpses of Valstan just out of reach, drawing him into trap after trap. The Qiraji had been created by the Old Gods, and psychological warfare was in their very nature. In one climactic battle, Fandral finally broke through to the chamber where Valstan was being held, but he arrived too late. The Qiraji General Rajax had kept Valstan alive specifically for this moment. As Fandral watched helplessly, Rajax tore the young druid apart before his father's eyes. The Qiraji commander then laughed and withdrew, leaving Fandral holding the broken body of his only son. The loss shattered something in Fandral Staghelm. His grief transformed into a burning hatred that would never fade. This hatred would eventually make him vulnerable to corruption, first by the Emerald Nightmare, and later by Ragnaros the Fire Lord. The seeds of his fall were planted in the sands of Xal'atath, watered by the blood of his son. Desperate, Fandral sought aid from the bronze dragonflight, who resided in the caverns of time near Tanaris. The dragons were initially reluctant to involve themselves in what seemed like a mortal conflict, but when the Qiraji attacked the caverns of time itself, they could no longer remain neutral. Anachronos, the son of the bronze dragon aspect Nosdormu, agreed to ally with the Night Elves and called upon the other dragonflights for assistance. The war reached its climax when the combined forces of the Night Elves and dragons finally pushed the Qiraji back to the gates of ahn'qiraj. But they could not defeat the endless swarms, and they knew that S'thun was growing stronger with each passing day. If the old god fully awakened, nothing would be able to stop it. Fandral and the dragons devised a desperate plan. They would seal the Qiraji within their own city, trapping them behind a magical barrier that they could not breach. Together, the druids and dragons worked a great spell, raising massive walls of stone and enchanted roots around ahn'qiraj. This became known as the Scarab Wall, an impenetrable barrier that cut off the Qiraji from the outside world. Anachronos forged 2 artifacts to control the barrier. the scarab gong, and the scepter of the shifting sands. He entrusted these to Fandral, who had lost his son Valston during the final battle. Fandral found no comfort in victory. His grief for his son consumed him, and in his rage and despair, he shattered the scepter of the shifting sands before Anachronos's eyes. The pieces were scattered across the world, ensuring that the barrier could not easily be opened. Fandral wanted the Qiraji sealed forever, wanted to ensure that the horrors within ahn'qiraj never again threatened the living. For 1,000 years, the scarab wall held. Behind its stones, the Qiraji continued to prepare, and Sethun continued to grow stronger. When the barrier was finally opened during the events of the ahn'qiraj War, the old god had nearly regenerated to its full power. Dark whispers rode on the winds of Xal'atath, and those sensitive to such things could feel something terrible stirring beneath the desert. The opening of ahn'qiraj required cooperation between the Alliance and Horde, a rare moment of unity against a common threat. Varrock Saurfang, chosen by both factions for his honor and tactical skill, led the combined assault. Adventurers stormed both the ruins of ahn'qiraj and the temple of ahn'qiraj itself, battling through legions of Qiraji to reach the old god's chamber. Sethun was terrifying to behold. Os' massive eye perched atop a tower of flesh and tentacles, its gaze bringing madness to all it touched. The battle against the old god was the most challenging that adventurers had faced to that point, a desperate struggle against an entity of nearly incomprehensible power. But somehow, against all odds, the champions of Azeroth prevailed. Sethun was defeated, its physical form broken, its influence temporarily contained. Like Yogg-Saron, Sethun could not be truly killed. Its essence remained embedded in Azeroth, part of the planet in a way that could not be severed without destroying the world itself. But its power was greatly diminished, its servants scattered, its plans set back by millennia. The Eye of Sethun was brought to the Red Dragon Kalistras as proof of victory, a trophy from a war that few mortals truly understood the magnitude of. The victory over Sethun marked the first time that mortal champions had directly confronted and defeated an old god. It was an achievement that the Titans themselves had deemed impossible, a demonstration of the potential that existed within the mortal races. The dragons who had fought in the War of the Shifting Sands understood the significance of what had been accomplished. They knew that the world owed its continued existence to the courage of those who had dared to enter the temple of ahn'qiraj. But the dragons also understood that victory was not the same as elimination. Sethun's physical form had been shattered, yes. Its immediate threat had been neutralized. But the old god's essence remained, lurking in the depths of ahn'qiraj, waiting for another opportunity to rise. The Qiraji had been scattered, but not destroyed. Given enough time, they might rebuild their strength, might begin working once more toward their god's resurrection. The aftermath of the ahn'qiraj War brought changes to the region of Xal'atath. The Cenarian Circle established a permanent presence there, creating the settlement of Cenarion Hold to monitor the defeated Qiraji and watch for signs of Sethun's resurgence. The Scarab Wall, though no longer needed as a barrier, was maintained as a reminder of the war that had been fought and the sacrifices that had been made. For years, Xal'atath remained quiet. The Qiraji retreated deeper into their tunnels, nursing their wounds and mourning their failure. Sethun's whispers faded to near silence, its power too diminished to reach beyond the walls of its prison. The defenders of Azeroth turned their attention to other threats, trusting that the old god had been sufficiently contained. But nothing involving the old gods ever truly ends. Xal'atath would later become the site of one of Azeroth's greatest wounds, a massive sword thrust into the planet's heart by the fallen titan Sargeras, and the energies released by that wound would attract attention from powers both new and ancient, setting the stage for conflicts yet to come. While Yogg-Saron whispered from Ulduar and C'Thun slumbered in ahn'qiraj, the influence of Y'Shaarj persisted in Pandaria, despite the old god's death. The seven Shah that had been born from its final breath sank deep into the land, where they lurked for over 10,000 years. They fed on negative emotions, growing stronger whenever creatures felt anger, hatred, fear, or despair. They could not act directly, but they could influence, amplify, and corrupt. The Mogu, Titan-forged servants who had been created to watch over the vault containing Y'Shaarj's heart, were among the first to feel the Shah's influence. When the curse of flesh transformed them into creatures of meat and bone, they lost the mental fortitude that had protected them from the old god's remnants. The Mogu became cruel and tyrannical, establishing an empire of slavery and brutality that would dominate Pandaria for thousands of years. The Mantid, descendants of the aqir who had served Y'Shaarj, retained their devotion to the dead old god. Unlike their Qiraji cousins, who had evolved to worship C'Thun, the Mantid remembered their original master. They believed that Y'Shaarj would one day return, and they waited patiently for that promised resurrection. Their entire civilization was structured around this faith, with rituals and traditions designed to honor the sleeping god. When the Sundering shattered the ancient supercontinent of Kalimdor, Pandaria was separated from the rest of the world. The Sundering itself was caused by the Night Elves' reckless use of the Well of Eternity, which attracted the attention of the Burning Legion and led to a war that nearly destroyed the world. When the well imploded, it tore the supercontinent apart, creating the continents and islands that exist today. The explosion killed millions and reshaped the very face of Azeroth. For Pandaria, the Sundering meant isolation. The last emperor of the Pandaren, Shao, knew that the coming Cataclysm would bring tremendous suffering to his people. He undertook a journey to purge himself of the negative emotions that would attract the Shah, casting off doubt, despair, fear, anger, hatred, and violence. But he could not free himself from the last emotion, pride. The journey of Emperor Shao has become legend among the Pandaren. He traveled across Pandaria, facing each of the Shah in turn and overcoming them through wisdom and inner strength. Each victory freed him from one of the negative emotions that bound him to the physical world. The Shah of doubt was overcome through certainty. The Shah of despair was defeated through hope. The Shah of fear fell before courage. Each manifestation was not destroyed, but was instead separated from Shao's spirit, left to lurk beneath the land where it would wait for new hosts. When Shao finally faced the Shah of pride, he could not overcome it. Pride was too deeply woven into his identity as an emperor, too essential to the confidence he needed to protect his people. He could not simply cast it off as he had the other emotions. So he accepted that this last Shah would remain with him, and he poured his spirit into the land itself, creating the mists that would hide Pandaria from the outside world. For 10,000 years, the mists held, Pandaria existed in a bubble outside of time, protected from the conflicts that ravaged the rest of Azeroth. The Pandaren developed their own civilization, free from the wars between Alliance and Horde, free from the Scourge and the Burning Legion. But they were never free from the Shah. The negative emotions of the Pandaren themselves, however mild compared to the outside world, still fed the manifestations that lurked beneath the surface. Xiao Hao's pride prevented him from truly letting go, and when he used his power to shroud Pandaria in mists, that pride merged with the land. The Shah of Pride, the most powerful and insidious of Y'Shaarj's remnants, remained hidden, waiting for the moment when it could finally manifest. For 10,000 years, Pandaria remained hidden from the outside world, its inhabitants protected from the conflicts that ravaged other continents, but never free from the Shah's latent influence. When the mists finally parted and the Alliance and Horde discovered Pandaria, they brought their war with them. The two factions fought across the beautiful land, and their conflict awakened the Shah. Anger, fear, despair, every negative emotion generated by the war fed the manifestations of Y'Shaarj's dying breath. The Shah emerged from the ground, possessed mortals, and wreaked havoc across Pandaria. The initial awakening came in the Jade Forest, where the first battles between Alliance and Horde forces took place. The violence of their conflict released the Shah of Doubt, which corrupted the ancient serpent's heart temple and nearly destroyed the jade serpent Yulon. The Pandaren, who had lived for 10,000 years without such intense conflict, were shocked by the devastation that followed in the outsider's wake. As the war spread across Pandaria, more Shah manifestations emerged. The Shah of Fear awakened in the Dread Wastes, strengthening the Mounted Swarm beyond anything the Pandaren had faced in centuries. The Shah of Anger roamed the Kunlai summit, driving anyone it touched into murderous rage. The Shah of Hatred and Violence manifested in the lands where fighting was most intense, creating feedback loops where conflict bred more conflict, emotions fed more manifestations, and the chaos spiraled ever upward. The Pandaren tried to warn the outsiders about what they were doing, but the Alliance and Horde were too focused on their war to listen. Taran Zhu, the leader of the Shadowpan monastic order, watched in horror as everything his people had worked for over 10,000 years began to unravel. The Shadowpan had been specifically trained to combat the Shah, but there were too many manifestations appearing too quickly for even their expertise to contain. The Shah did not simply emerge as monsters to be fought. They possessed mortals, twisting their minds and amplifying their worst qualities. Soldiers who had been merely aggressive became psychotically violent. Those who harbored doubts about their cause became paralyzed with uncertainty. The fearful became catatonic with terror. Every negative emotion was magnified to destructive levels, and the possessed often had no memory of what they had done once the Shah released them. The worst corruption, however, came from Garrosh Hellscream, the war chief of the Horde. Garrosh was consumed by pride and a desperate need for power. He had led his people into a war they could not win, and he refused to accept defeat. When his goblin excavators unearthed the vault containing Y'Shaarj's heart, Garrosh saw an opportunity to turn the tide of the conflict. The heart of Y'Shaarj had been dormant for millennia, but it was not dead. When Garrosh brought it to the magical pools of the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, the arcane waters began to revive the terrible artifact. The heart beat once more, its dark power seeping into the land. The veil, which had been one of the most beautiful and sacred places in Pandaria, was corrupted almost instantly. The Shah of Pride, finally freed by Garrosh's actions, manifested within the vault where the heart had been hidden. Garrosh took the heart to Orgrimmar, to a secret chamber beneath the city he had built specifically to house his new weapon. There, surrounded by his most loyal followers and the Mantid who had come to worship their god's remains, Garrosh prepared for the final confrontation with his enemies. He had no intention of using the heart subtly. He would absorb its power directly, becoming an avatar of Y'Sharj himself. The siege of Orgrimmar brought the combined forces of the Alliance and the Horde rebels who opposed Garrosh's tyranny into the heart of the Orcish capital. They fought through legions of corrupted orcs, dark shaman, who had enslaved the elements, and Garrosh's fanatical followers. In the depths beneath the city, they faced the Shah of Pride itself, finally destroying the last and most powerful of Y'Sharj's manifestations. The assault on the depths beneath Orgrimmar revealed horrors that even veterans of the Northrend campaign had not expected. Garrosh had been busy during his time with the Heart, conducting experiments that blurred the line between mortal and old god. Some of his Kor'kron had been transformed into creatures that resembled Enraki more than orcs, their bodies warped beyond recognition by the corruption they had willingly embraced. Others had been fused with elemental forces, becoming living weapons that could summon fire or shake the earth with a gesture. The Mantid Paragons who had allied with Garrosh proved to be formidable opponents. These ancient warriors, resurrected from ages past by the Klaxis' rituals, fought with weapons and techniques that had been perfected over thousands of years. They believed that serving the heart of Y'Sharj was their sacred duty, the culmination of everything their race had worked toward since the Black Empire's fall. Even as they were defeated, they expressed satisfaction that they had served their god one final time. When the adventurers finally reached Garrosh's inner sanctum, they found him merged with the heart of Y'Sharj. The Orc warchief had become something monstrous, his body warped by old god corruption, his mind filled with Y'Sharj's ancient malevolence. He spoke with a voice that was not entirely his own, mixing orcish battle cries with whispers in languages that had not been spoken since the Black Empire's fall. The battle was fought partially in the physical world and partially in visions of Pandaria's locations, as the heart tried to break the will of the champions who opposed it. Champions found themselves transported to the Jade Forest, where they faced manifestations of the destruction they had caused during their first battles on Pandaria. They were shown the veil as it had been before Garrosh corrupted it, then forced to watch as that beauty was despoiled. The heart wielded guilt as a weapon, trying to convince the champions that they were no better than Garrosh himself. Only through unity and determination did the champions prevail. They recognized the heart's manipulations for what they were and refused to surrender to despair. They supported each other when individuals faltered, covering for weaknesses and amplifying strengths. It was a reminder that the greatest weapon against old god corruption was not power, but solidarity, not individual might, but collective purpose. In the end, Garrosh was defeated. The heart of Y'Sharj, drained of the power Garrosh had absorbed, finally fell silent. Its last energies dissipated, leaving nothing behind but a fading breath. After tens of thousands of years, Y'Shaarj was truly gone, its physical form destroyed by Aman'Thul, its heart depleted by Garrosh's folly, its Shah manifestations vanquished by the champions of Azeroth. The mightiest of the old gods, the one that even the Titans had feared to face directly, was finally and completely destroyed. But its legacy endured in the scars it had left on Pandaria, in the trauma suffered by those who had faced the Shah, and in the lesson that the Void's corruption could persist long after its source was eliminated. The destruction of Y'Shaarj's heart and the defeat of the Shah marked a turning point in the struggle against the old gods. For the first time, an old god had been completely and finally destroyed, not merely imprisoned, not merely diminished, but truly eliminated from existence. The physical form that Aman'Thul had destroyed was now matched by the destruction of the spiritual remnants that had persisted in Pandaria. This victory came at tremendous cost. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms, once one of the most beautiful places in Pandaria, lay scarred by the corruption that Garrosh had unleashed. The Pandaren who had tended that sacred place for generations wept at its destruction. The magical pools that had sustained the land for millennia were tainted, their waters turned foul by the touch of old god energy. But even in their grief, the Pandaren recognized that the alternative had been far worse. If Garrosh had succeeded, if he had fully merged with the heart of Y'Shaarj and become an avatar of the old god, the destruction would have spread far beyond the Vale. All of Pandaria might have fallen, perhaps all of Azeroth. The cost of victory was high, but the cost of defeat would have been total. In the years that followed, the Pandaren worked to heal the Vale. It was slow work, requiring patience and dedication that only a people who had lived with the Shah for millennia could muster. Gradually, the corruption began to fade. New growth emerged from the blighted soil. The waters slowly purified themselves. The Vale would never be exactly as it had been, but it would live again. The other races of Azeroth learned from what had happened in Pandaria. They saw how negative emotions could feed the remnants of old god power, how the Shah had used conflict and despair as weapons against the living. This knowledge would prove valuable in the conflicts to come, as the mortal races continued their eternal struggle against the forces of corruption. Of the 4 old gods who fell upon Azeroth, N'Zoth was considered the weakest. Queen Ashara, who would come to serve this old god, described it as the weakest of its siblings. Even the artifact Xal'atath acknowledged N'Zoth's lesser status among the 4, but where the other old gods relied on overwhelming power or terrible presence, N'Zoth worked through manipulation, corruption, and patience measured in millennia. N'Zoth's territory during the Black Empire had covered much of what would later become the Eastern Kingdoms. When the Titans defeated the old gods and sealed them away, N'Zoth was the first to be imprisoned. It was locked in a Titan-wrought prison far beneath the sea, in depths so dark that light had never touched them. There N'Zoth waited, plotting and scheming, reaching out with its influence to corrupt whatever it could touch. The first, and perhaps greatest of N'Zoth's corruptions, was Neltharion, the Earth Warder. This black dragon had been blessed by the Titans themselves, given stewardship over the deep places of the world. Neltharion was powerful and wise, trusted by his fellow dragon aspects and respected throughout Azeroth. He was the perfect target for N'Zoth's whispers. The old god's corruption worked slowly, seeping into Neltharion's mind over thousands of years. N'Zoth offered the dragon visions of power and glory, promises of dominion over all creation. It played on Neltharion's pride, his desire to be recognized as the mightiest of the aspects. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Earth Warder began to change. His thoughts grew darker, his ambitions more twisted. He began to hear voices that no one else could hear, to see possibilities that no one else could imagine. N'Zoth guided Neltharion in the creation of the Dragon Soul, an artifact of immense power that the Earth Warder presented as a weapon against the Burning Legion during the War of the Ancients. The other dragon aspects, trusting their brother, infused the artifact with portions of their own power. They did not realize that the dragon soul had been designed to drain their strength and concentrate it in Neltharion's hands. When the trap was sprung, Neltharion was transformed. He became Deathwing, the Destroyer, a being of fire and madness who would threaten Azeroth for millennia to come. The transformation was not merely psychological, but physical as well. The power Neltharion had taken from his siblings, combined with the void energy flowing through him from N'Zoth, proved too much for even his mighty form to contain. His body began to crack and split, molten fire showing through the gaps in his scales. His rage became so intense that he literally burned from within, requiring plates of elementium metal to be bolted onto his flesh to hold him together. Deathwing's black dragonflight followed their aspect into madness. The corruption spread through the entire flight, twisting them into agents of destruction and chaos. Where once they had protected the deep places of the world, now they sought to exploit and corrupt those same places. The black dragons became N'Zoth's most powerful mortal servants, working to undermine the other flights and advance the old god's agenda. The betrayal at the War of the Ancients was just the beginning. Over the millennia that followed, Deathwing would appear again and again to threaten Azeroth. He created the Twilight's Hammer cult to worship the old gods. He experimented on dragon eggs to create the Twilight Dragonflight, abominations that combined the powers of all 5 flights. He worked with Sinestra, his consort, to breed new horrors in the depths of grim battle. Each of these schemes served N'Zoth's ultimate purpose. The old god was patient, and it used Deathwing as the centerpiece of plans that would take thousands of years to mature. Every act of destruction the Destroyer caused, every dragon he corrupted, every mortal he manipulated, brought the hour of twilight closer to reality. N'Zoth's second great corruption occurred in the aftermath of the Sundering. Queen Ashara and her high-born followers had helped bring the Burning Legion to Azeroth, and when the Well of Eternity exploded, they were caught in the Cataclysm. The waters of the sea rushed in to fill the void left by the well's destruction, sweeping Ashara and her followers into the depths. As Ashara drowned, N'Zoth reached out to her with an offer. The old god showed her visions of the Black Empire, of the glory it had possessed before the Titans came. It offered to save her life in exchange for her service. Ashara, ever proud and cunning, did not simply accept servitude. She convinced N'Zoth that she would not be a slave, but a queen, ruling at the old god's side rather than beneath it. Impressed by her audacity, N'Zoth agreed. The transformation was immediate and terrible. Ashara and her highborn were twisted into new forms, creatures that could survive in the crushing depths of the sea. They became the Naga, serpentine beings with tremendous magical power. Ashara herself was transformed into something magnificent and monstrous, a being of tentacles and dark beauty who ruled her new kingdom from the ocean floor. The Naga would serve in Xal'atath for over 10,000 years, working toward the old gods' eventual freedom. The Naga built a vast civilization beneath the waves. Their capital, Nazjatar, was constructed using magic and slave labor, a city of coral and stone that rivaled anything the Night Elves had ever built on the surface. From this buzz, the Naga expanded their influence across the ocean floor, establishing outposts and colonies in every sea. They watched the surface world through spells and spies, waiting for the moment when Xal'atath would command them to strike. Ashara never lost her ambition or her pride. She considered herself Xal'atath's equal rather than its servant, and the old god seemed content to let her maintain this illusion. In truth, Xal'atath knew that Ashara's pride made her easy to manipulate. As long as she believed she was in control, she would serve its purposes willingly. The moment she truly threatened Xal'atath's plans, the old god could destroy her with a thought. The Naga engaged in countless conflicts over the millennia, raiding coastal settlements and sinking ships. They clashed with the Murlocs, the Makrura, and any other creatures that threatened their territory. They retrieved artifacts from the sunken ruins of the original Well of Eternity, preserving and amplifying their magical power. All of this was preparation for the war that Xal'atath knew would eventually come. Perhaps most importantly, the Naga remembered. They preserved the history of Queen Ashara's empire, the glory of the Highborn, the power they had once wielded. This memory fueled their hatred of the Night Elves who had survived the Sundering, the descendants of those who had opposed Ashara's alliance with the Legion. When the Naga finally revealed themselves to the surface world, that ancient hatred would drive them to terrible acts of vengeance. Xal'atath also played a role in one of the most insidious corruptions of the natural world, the Emerald Nightmare. The Emerald Dream was a parallel realm, a blueprint of Azeroth as it might have been without the influence of intelligent life. Druids could enter this dream and draw power from it, and the green dragonflight was charged with protecting its sanctity. But Xal'atath found a way in. The corruption began when the roots of the World Tree, Yggdrasil, reached too deep, touching the prison of Yogg-Saron in Ulduar. This opened a door into the Emerald Dream, one that the old gods could exploit. Xal'atath, working in concert with its sibling, began to spread corruption through the dream, transforming parts of it into a twisted reflection called the Emerald Nightmare. Green dragons who entered the corrupted areas emerged changed, their minds touched by madness. Druids who slept too long in the dream found themselves trapped in eternal darkness. The satyr Xavius, a former servant of Ashara who had been transformed into a demonic creature, became Xal'atath's primary agent within the nightmare. He spread the corruption further, capturing and torturing Malfurion Stormrage, and threatening to plunge all of Azeroth into eternal sleep. The champions of Azeroth eventually defeated Xavius in the depths of the Emerald Nightmare, but the corruption was never fully cleansed. Xal'atath's influence remained, dormant but not dead. Xavius had a long and terrible history with the Night Elves. He had been Ashara's chief advisor and most devoted follower during the War of the Ancients, the one who had first made contact with the Burning Legion. When Malfurion Stormrage defeated him, Sargeras transformed Xavius into the first satyr as punishment for his failure. But this new form also gave Xavius power over nature, twisted though it was. When Xavius was killed again, his spirit was claimed by N'Zoth, rather than passing on to whatever fate awaited him. The old god saw value in this bitter, hateful creature, and it gave Xavius a new existence within the Emerald Nightmare. There, Xavius became the Nightmare Lord, a being of tremendous power who embodied the corruption of the dream itself. The Nightmare Lord's campaign against the mortal world lasted for years. He corrupted the ancient Ursoc, the Great Bear Spirit. He twisted Cenarius's son, Remulos, nearly claiming one of the most powerful nature spirits in existence. Captured Ysera, the dragon aspect herself, and used her connection to the dream to spread the nightmare even further. Each victory fed the corruption, making it stronger and harder to combat. When adventurers finally entered the Emerald Nightmare to stop Xavius, they faced horrors beyond imagining. The nightmare had transformed the dream into a realm of darkness and despair, where every fear became manifest and every hope was consumed. Xavius himself was a towering figure of corruption, his power amplified by the countless minds he had enslaved. His defeat was a significant victory, but it came at terrible cost. Ysera herself had to be killed to stop her rampage, a tragedy that demonstrated the true cruelty of the old gods' schemes. While N'Zoth corrupted the powerful and infiltrated the sacred, the three remaining old gods formed an alliance. This coalition, known to those few who learned of it as the Three, was unprecedented. The old gods had always fought each other as much as they fought external enemies. But faced with imprisonment and the slow work of corrupting a world from their prisons, they recognized the value of cooperation. The three worked together toward a common goal, the hour of twilight. This was a prophecy, a vision of a future where the old gods would break free from their prisons, where Azeroth would be destroyed, and where the dark titan that the Void Lords sought to create would finally be born. Everything the old gods did, every corruption they spread, and every plot they hatched, served this ultimate purpose. The hour of twilight was more than a prophecy. It was a coordinated plan, a strategy that the three old gods had developed over millennia of patient scheming. Every corruption they spread, every mind they twisted, every dragon and mortal and keeper they turned to their service was a step toward this ultimate goal. And the culmination of their efforts came during the Cataclysm, when N'Zoth finally unleashed its greatest weapon. Deathwing had been hiding for years, recovering from the wounds he had sustained during his previous attempt to destroy Azeroth. In the realm of Deepholm, within the elemental plane, the destroyer rebuilt his shattered body with plates of elemental metal bolted directly onto his form to contain the power that constantly threatened to tear him apart. N'Zoth guided this reconstruction, keeping its puppet alive and focused on their shared goal. When Deathwing was ready, N'Zoth gave the command. The black dragon exploded from Deepholm into Azeroth, igniting the Cataclysm. The force of his emergence shattered the Pillar of the World, the artifact that kept the elemental plane separate from Azeroth. The barrier between realms weakened, allowing elemental invasions across the world. More importantly, Deathwing's eruption caused earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and flooding on a massive scale. The face of Azeroth was forever changed. The moment of Deathwing's emergence has been described by those who witnessed it as the end of the world. The sky split open over the maelstrom, and a shape of fire and shadow burst forth from the ground. Those who looked directly at Deathwing in that moment were often driven mad by what they saw, a creature of such immense size and terrible malevolence that their minds could not process it. The destroyer's roar echoed across continents, and even those who did not know what was happening felt a primal terror seize their hearts. Deathwing did not simply emerge and wait. He immediately began his campaign of destruction, flying across Azeroth and laying waste to any settlement he encountered. The city of Stormwind suffered a devastating attack when Deathwing passed over its towers, melting stone and killing hundreds with his mere presence. The barrens were torn apart by the earthquakes that followed in his wake. Aberdeen, the Night Elven port, was shattered by tsunamis generated by his passage. The destroyer's rampage was not random. Every attack served a purpose in N'Zoth's grand design. The destruction of key alliance and horde settlements weakened both factions, reducing their ability to mount a coordinated response. The elemental invasions that followed the shattering of the Pillar of the World occupied defenders who might otherwise have hunted Deathwing himself. The fear and chaos that spread served as weapons in their own right, softening Azeroth's defenses for the final assault. Deathwing's children carried out their own missions during the Cataclysm. Onyxia, who had been slain by adventurers years before, was resurrected through dark rituals and set to guarding her father's interests. Nefarian, also resurrected, continued his experiments in creating new, draconic horrors in the depths of Blackwing descent. Sinestra worked to produce more Twilight dragons, building the army that would serve the old gods in their final victory. The Black Dragonflight had become a machine of corruption, every member serving the will of entities they might not even have known about. As chaos spread, N'Zoth attacked on multiple fronts. The Twilight's Hammer Cult, an organization of mortal worshippers devoted to the old gods, emerged from hiding to carry out acts of terrorism and sacrifice. The Twilight Dragonflight, corrupted offspring of Deathwing's black dragons, joined the assault. The Naga began military operations in coastal regions around the world. Everything the old god had cultivated over millennia was deployed at once. The goal was to overwhelm Azeroth's defenders, to spread destruction so widely that no force could stop it all. Even if most of N'Zoth's attacks were defeated, even one success could be enough to trigger the Hour of Twilight. The world would fall into darkness, the old gods would be freed, and the world soul of Azeroth would finally be claimed by the Void. But N'Zoth had underestimated the defenders of Azeroth. The mortal races, though battered by years of war against each other, rallied against the common threat. The dragon aspects, though weakened by past conflicts, united to stop Deathwing. The champions of the Alliance and Horde fought on multiple fronts, pushing back the Twilight's hammer, defeating the elemental incursions, and hunting down the servants of the old gods wherever they appeared. The final confrontation came at the Maelstrom, where Deathwing had gone to complete the destruction of Azeroth. The dragon soul was the key to this confrontation, and obtaining it required a journey through time itself. The bronze dragonflight, led by Nosdormu, opened portways to the past, allowing champions to witness and participate in key moments from history when the dragon soul had been used or lost. Champions traveled to the War of the Ancients, where they saw the dragon soul in its first use. They witnessed Deathwing's betrayal of his fellow aspects, the moment when Neltharion revealed what he had become. They retrieved the artifact before it could be lost to the ravages of time. They also traveled to the moment when the Well of Eternity was destroyed, witnessing the sundering itself from within the chaos of that terrible cataclysm. The journey through time was dangerous, not merely because of the events being witnessed, but because of the creatures that dwelt between moments. The infinite dragonflight attempted to interfere at every step, seeking to prevent the champions from obtaining the weapon that could destroy their master's puppet. Murazond himself, the corrupted echo of Nosdormu, made a final stand to protect Deathwing's future, and he was defeated only through tremendous sacrifice. With the dragon soul finally in hand, the dragon aspects and the mortal champions pursued Deathwing to the maelstrom. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had come before. Deathwing was a creature of overwhelming power, his body a furnace of corruption and rage. Even wielding the dragon soul, the combined forces of the aspects and their mortal allies struggled to wound him. In a desperate battle, they managed to use the artifact against its creator, destroying Deathwing and ending his threat forever. The dragon soul, empowered by the last of the aspect's Titan-given authority, punched through Deathwing's elementium armor and struck at the corruption within. The destroyer's body came apart, his flames extinguished, his darkness banished. The most powerful agent of the old gods in all of Azeroth's history was finally, irrevocably dead. With Deathwing's death, the hour of twilight was averted. And Zoth's greatest weapon was gone, its carefully laid plans disrupted. The old god had come closer than ever before to achieving its goal, but in the end it had failed. It retreated back to its schemes, plotting new approaches, waiting for new opportunities. The cataclysm was over, but Zoth was far from defeated. The aftermath of the cataclysm left Azeroth scarred in ways that would take years to heal. The damage Deathwing had caused during his emergence from Deepholm had permanently altered the landscape of multiple continents. The Barrens were split in two by a massive lava-filled chasm. Thousand Needles was flooded, its iconic stone spires now rising from a newly formed lake. The searing gorge and burning steppes suffered further devastation. Coastal cities around the world were battered by tsunamis and flooding, but perhaps the most significant damage was psychological. The mortal races now knew that their world could be shattered by forces beyond their control. They had seen an aspect of the dragon flights, a being blessed by the Titans themselves, twisted into an agent of destruction. If Neltharion could fall to old god corruption, who else might be vulnerable? This fear would linger for years, coloring every interaction with ancient powers and cosmic forces. The Twilight's hammer cult was largely destroyed in the aftermath of Deathwing's fall, but it was not completely eliminated. Pockets of worshippers survived, hiding in remote locations and continuing their devotion to the old gods. These survivors would eventually be recruited by new threats, their knowledge of old god rituals, and their willingness to embrace corruption, making them valuable assets to anyone seeking to harness void power. The dragons who had sacrificed so much to stop Deathwing found themselves facing an uncertain future. The dragon aspects had given up the last of their Titan-given power to empower the dragon soul against Deathwing. They were no longer aspects in truth, merely powerful dragons without the cosmic authority they had once wielded. Alexstrasza, Nosdormu, Ysera, and Kalikos would continue to serve as protectors and advisors, but the age of dragon dominion over Azeroth's fate was over. The future would belong to the mortal races. The failure of the Hour of Twilight forced N'Zoth to develop new strategies. If overwhelming force would not work, perhaps a more subtle approach would succeed. The old god had always been the schemer among its siblings, the one who worked through manipulation rather than power. Now it would rely on those skills entirely. N'Zoth's next plan centered on its oldest and most devoted servants, Queen Ashara and the Naga. For over 10,000 years, Ashara had ruled her undersea kingdom, building the strength of the Naga and waiting for the opportunity to strike at the surface world. N'Zoth had promised her a return to glory, a restoration of the empire she had lost in the Sundering. Now the old god would deliver on that promise, though not in the way Ashara expected. The scheme began during the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde, known as the Fourth War. As the two factions fought over the wounded world, Ashara saw an opportunity. She lured both the Alliance and the Horde navies to Nazjatar, the capital of her undersea empire, where she planned to capture them and use their forces for her own purposes. But this was merely the first stage of a larger plan. Ashara's true goal, guided by N'Zoth, was to use the combined power of the Alliance and Horde champions to break the final seals on the old god's prison. The Tidestone of Golganath, one of the pillars of creation that had been used to seal the old gods away, was the key. By manipulating events so that the champions would be forced to use the Tidestone to save themselves, Ashara could breach the last prison and free N'Zoth. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Ashara had spent millennia preparing Nazjatar for this moment, fortifying it against any assault and filling it with her most powerful servants. When the Alliance and Horde fleets arrived, drawn by her machinations, they found themselves stranded in a place they had never imagined entering. The sea itself had parted at Ashara's command, leaving their ships grounded in the depths of the ocean. The champions who had come to stop Ashara found themselves fighting for survival against the full might of the Naga Empire. Lady Ashvane of Kul Tiras, who had allied herself with Ashara in exchange for power, commanded siege weapons designed to destroy any who opposed the queen. The Priscilla, serpentine beasts of tremendous size hunted through the ruins and coral forests. Naga sirens sang songs of death that could shatter minds and bones alike. But the champions were not alone. They found unlikely allies in Nazjatar's depths. The Ankoan, descendants of the Jinyu, who had escaped the Naga millennia ago, fought alongside the Alliance. The unshackled Gilblin, who had freed themselves from Naga slavery, aided the Horde. Even Lady Jaina Proudmoore and Lorthamer Theron, leaders of factions that had been at each other's throats just months before, recognized that survival required cooperation. The battle against Ashara raged through multiple fronts. Champions assaulted Naga strongholds, disrupted their supply lines, and weakened their defenses. They recovered artifacts that had been hidden in Nazjatar for 10,000 years. They faced manifestations of N'Zoth's power that had been growing in strength as the old god's prison weakened. Each victory brought them closer to the Eternal Palace, where Ashara waited with the Tidestone. The scheme worked. In the depths of the Eternal Palace, The champions of Azeroth defeated Ashara, but their victory came at a terrible cost. The battle had provided exactly what N'Zoth needed, the power to finally break free from its prison. For the first time in over 70,000 years, an old god walked free upon Azeroth. N'Zoth's emergence was not immediately apparent. The old god was cunning enough to hide its awakening, allowing its influence to spread before announcing its presence. Corruption seeped across the world, touching minds and twisting loyalties. The Black Empire began to rise again, Nraki and Aqir emerging from dormancy to serve their master. And Ny'alotha, the sleeping city of nightmares, began to manifest in the physical world. The first signs of N'Zoth's freedom were subtle. People began having strange dreams, visions of a dark city rising from the depths. Those with connections to magical powers found their abilities behaving erratically, tainted by void energy they could not understand. Some heard whispers, voices promising power and glory to those who would embrace the coming darkness. Then the assaults began. In Xal'atath, where Sargeras's sword had wounded Azeroth, N'Zoth's minions attacked the Azerite mining operations. In the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, the corruption that had been cleansed after Garrosh's defeat began to spread once more. In Uldum, the Titan facilities that had been built to safeguard against exactly this kind of threat came under siege from forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. Magni Bronzebeard, the speaker for Azeroth, was among the first to understand what had happened. Through his connection to the planet's world soul, he sensed N'Zoth's awakening and the corruption that was spreading from the old god's presence. Magni had dedicated years to healing Azeroth's wounds, and now he faced the terrifying realization that those wounds might never fully close while N'Zoth remained free. The champions of Azeroth rallied once more, but this time the threat was unlike any they had faced. N'Zoth was not a single enemy to be confronted and defeated. It was an infection spreading through reality itself, corrupting everything it touched. Even as adventurers fought against the old god's minions, they had to contend with the possibility that their allies might be compromised, that their victories might be illusions, that reality itself could no longer be trusted. Ny'alotha was N'Zoth's domain, a realm of horror and madness that existed in the spaces between reality. It was similar to the Emerald Dream in concept, a parallel plane born from the dreams of powerful entities, but where the dream reflected nature's potential, Ny'alotha reflected the nightmare of the Black Empire. As N'Zoth's power grew, the boundaries between Ny'alotha and Azeroth began to thin. The old god launched assaults across the world, seeking to acquire the artifacts and locations that would allow it to claim Azeroth permanently. In the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, N'Zoth sought the engine of Nalaksha, a Titan device of tremendous power. In Uldum, it targeted the Forge of Origination, the weapon the Titans had designed to purge Azeroth of corruption if all other defenses failed. N'Zoth corrupted the Titan Keeper Ra, turning this ancient guardian against the world he had been created to protect. The champions of Azeroth rallied once more against the old god threat. Using the heart of Azeroth, an artifact that could channel the world soul's own power, they fought back against N'Zoth's assaults. They pushed into Ny'alotha itself, battling through the nightmarish realm to reach the old god at its heart. The final confrontation with N'Zoth took place in the Locus of Infinite Truths, a chamber deep within the old god's body. The battle was fought across two realms simultaneously, with champions contending against N'Zoth's tentacles in the physical world, while also braving the visions and nightmares it projected into their minds. It was perhaps the most challenging battle ever fought against an old god, a desperate struggle against an entity that had finally achieved its freedom. The assault on Ny'alotha required pushing through layers of nightmare reality. Champions faced twisted versions of familiar places and corrupted echoes of fallen heroes. They battled Wrathion, the black dragon who had been manipulated by N'Zoth despite his best efforts to resist. They confronted Il'gynoth, the manifestation of corruption that had terrorized the Emerald Nightmare. They faced down Carapace of N'Zoth itself, a massive construct of corrupted flesh that served as the old god's outer defenses. Throughout the assault, N'Zoth taunted the champions with visions of their failures and fears. It showed them futures where they had been corrupted, where their allies had fallen, where Azeroth had been consumed. It whispered that their resistance was futile, that they had already lost, that everything they fought for would eventually belong to the void. The psychological assault was as dangerous as the physical one. The heart of Azeroth, the artifact that champions had been using to heal the world's wounds, proved essential to surviving N'Zoth's assaults. Imbued with the power of the world soul itself, the heart could channel energies that disrupted the old god's corruption. It allowed champions to see through illusions, to resist whispers, to strike at vulnerabilities that would otherwise be hidden. Without the heart, the assault on Ny'alotha would have been impossible. When the champions finally reached N'Zoth's true form, they found something that defied description. The old god was not a single creature, but an ever-shifting mass of eyes and tentacles and mouths, reality warping around it as if the universe itself could not decide what shape it should take. N'Zoth spoke with 1,000 voices, each one promising different things, threatening different fates, revealing different truths. In the end, the champions prevailed. Using the heart of Azeroth in conjunction with the Forge of Origination, they channeled enough power to destroy N'Zoth utterly. The old god was not merely defeated or imprisoned this time. Its physical form was annihilated, its essence scattered, its consciousness extinguished. For the first time in Azeroth's history, an old god was truly killed without catastrophic damage to the planet. The reason this was possible, when the Titans themselves had been unable to kill the old gods without destroying Azeroth, remained unclear. Perhaps N'Zoth had not been as deeply embedded in the planet as its siblings. Perhaps the heart of Azeroth allowed for a more surgical strike than the Titan's raw power. Or perhaps the world soul itself contributed to its own defense, lending strength to the champions who fought to protect it. Whatever the reason, N'Zoth was gone, and Azeroth was finally free of its oldest and most insidious enemy. Magni Bronzebeard, the speaker for Azeroth, declared after the battle that the planet was finally free of the old god's grasp. After tens of thousands of years, the corruption that had threatened to consume Azeroth's world soul had been defeated. But even in victory, questions remained. Yogg-Saron still lurked in Ulduar, diminished but not destroyed. C'Thun's essence persisted beneath ahn'qiraj, and the Void Lords, who had created the old gods in the first place, still watched from beyond reality, hungry and patient as ever. Throughout their long reign and their even longer imprisonment, the old gods commanded vast armies of servants. These minions were not merely soldiers or slaves, but extensions of the old god's will, creatures whose very existence was tied to the entities that had created them. Understanding these servants is essential to understanding the full scope of the old god's influence on Azeroth. The ahn'qiraj, also called faceless ones, were the elite servants of the Black Empire. These creatures arose from the organic matter that seeped from the old god's forms, making them literally born from their masters. The ahn'qiraj possessed intelligence far beyond mere animals, capable of complex strategy and powerful magic. They served as generals, taskmasters, and priests, organizing the old god's forces and maintaining their temples. The most powerful ahn'qiraj were the Seathrax, massive warlords who commanded legions in the old god's eternal wars. These creatures that were far larger and more resilient than ordinary faceless ones, possessing power that rivaled that of lesser deities. Names like Xal'atath, Kithix, and Mithrax echoed through history, associated with devastating campaigns and terrible destruction. Even after the Black Empire fell, Seathrax occasionally emerged from dormancy to threaten the mortal races. Kithix was perhaps the most devastating of the Seathrax to survive into the modern era. This ancient warlord had served C'Thun during the height of the Black Empire, commanding armies of aqir against the Titan Forged. When the Empire fell, Kithix was sealed away in a prison beneath the earth, slumbering for countless millennia. The trolls of the Zandalari Empire eventually discovered Kithix's prison, and not understanding what lay within, accidentally freed the ancient horror. The Seathrax immediately resumed its ancient purpose, rallying the scattered aqir and launching a devastating war against the troll empires. This conflict, known as the Aqir and Troll War, would reshape the face of ancient Kalimdor and leave scars that persist to the present day. The trolls fought with everything they had, but Kithix's forces seemed endless. The Seathrax drove them back across the continent, threatening to exterminate the troll race entirely. Only through unity and desperate sacrifice did the trolls eventually prevail, killing Kithix in a climactic battle that cost countless lives. But the aqir survived, scattering to the far corners of the world, where they would eventually evolve into the distinct races that trouble Azeroth today. Mithrax the Unraveler was another Seathrax who left a mark on history. This servant of Xal'atath was sent to Uldum in ancient times, where it slaughtered the Titan-forged guardians and nearly destroyed the Titan facilities that protected the region. The Tol'vir who survived Mithrax's assault were forever changed, some accepting corruption in exchange for power, while others fled to become the desert-dwelling culture they remain today. Xal'atath, who served in Xal'atath directly, was perhaps the most cunning of the Seathrax. This creature led campaigns against its master's sibling Old Gods during the internal conflicts of the Black Empire, demonstrating a tactical acumen unusual for ahn'qiraj. When Xal'atath was finally freed millennia later, Xal'atath emerged from wherever it had been hiding to serve its master once more, ultimately falling to adventurers who stormed Ny'alotha. Below the ahn'qiraj in the hierarchy were the aqir, insectoid creatures of remarkable resilience and adaptability. The aqir were the workers and soldiers of the Black Empire, constructing the massive citadels and fighting the endless wars that characterized that dark age. They were not individually intelligent, but their collective behavior was coordinated by their ahn'qiraj overseers, allowing them to act as a single, efficient organism. After the fall of the Black Empire, the aqir scattered and evolved into several distinct races. The Qiraji developed in the desert regions near Sithun's prison, becoming the insectoid army that would later wage the War of the Shifting Sands. The Nerubians evolved in the frozen north, developing a sophisticated civilization in the underground kingdom of Azjol-Nerub. Uniquely among the Aqir descendants, the Nerubians rejected worship of the old gods, developing their own culture and values. The Mantid evolved in Pandaria, in the lands still saturated with Yasharj's residual influence. Unlike the Nerubians, the Mantid retained their devotion to the old gods, specifically to Yasharj, whom they believed would one day return. Their entire civilization was built around this faith, with religious rituals and military traditions designed to honor their dead god and prepare for its resurrection. The Mantid developed a unique cycle of warfare and renewal that defined their society. Every 100 years, the Mantid would swarm, sending their warriors crashing against the great serpent's spine wall that separated their lands from the rest of Pandaria. This was not merely war, but a form of religious observance, a way of testing their people and culling the weak. Those who survived the swarm were considered the strongest of their generation, worthy to continue the Mantid legacy. The Pandaren, through the Mogu and later on their own, maintained the serpent's spine precisely to contain these swarms. The wall stretched for hundreds of miles, a monument to the constant vigilance required to keep the Mantid at bay. Every century, Pandaren defenders would man the wall, fighting off waves of Mantid attackers who seemed to care nothing for their own lives. What made the Mantid truly terrifying was their absolute certainty that Yasharj would return. They preserved relics of the old god, maintained temples in its honor, and passed down oral traditions about the days when their master had ruled the world. When Garrosh Hellscream began experimenting with the heart of Yasharj, the Mantid saw it as the fulfillment of their prophecies. Many of them allied with Garrosh, believing that he was the instrument of their god's resurrection. The Klaxi, the Mantid's council of elders and paragons, were initially skeptical of Garrosh, but when they learned that he possessed the heart of Yasharj, they pledged their loyalty to the Orc warchief. They made clear that their alliance was not with Garrosh personally, but with whatever force served their god. This cold pragmatism shocked many who encountered it, a reminder that the Mantid's devotion to Yasharj superseded all other considerations. Beyond these original servant races, the old gods also acquired followers among the mortal races of Azeroth. The Twilight's Hammer was the most prominent cult devoted to the old gods, an organization that believed the hour of twilight would bring about a new world order in which their devotion would be rewarded. The cult recruited from all races, promising power and purpose to those who felt alienated from normal society. The Twilight's Hammer had originated as an orc clan during the First War, led by a chieftain named Cho'Gall. This two-headed ogre mage had been one of the most powerful spellcasters in the Old Horde, but his true allegiance was always to darker powers. When the Horde was defeated and scattered, Cho'Gall led his followers in search of new masters, eventually discovering the imprisoned old gods and pledging the Twilight's Hammer to their service. Under Cho'Gall's leadership, the cult spread across both continents. They established hidden temples in remote locations, recruited new members through promises of power and purpose, and worked to advance the old gods' agenda wherever they could. When Deathwing emerged during the Cataclysm, the Twilight's hammer provided much of his mortal support, conducting rituals and sacrifices that empowered the Destroyer's campaign. Cho'Gall was eventually killed by adventurers in the Bastion of Twilight, but his death did not end the cult. Other leaders rose to take his place, and the Twilight's hammer continued its work. Some cells focused on corrupting existing institutions, infiltrating governments and organizations to subvert them from within. Others worked more directly, kidnapping victims for sacrifice and attempting to free the imprisoned old gods through dark rituals. The cult's members came from all walks of life. Some were genuinely mad, their minds broken by exposure to the old gods' whispers. Others were simply power-hungry, willing to serve any master who offered them advancement. Still others believed that the hour of twilight was inevitable and sought to position themselves on the winning side. Whatever their motivations, the cultists shared a willingness to commit terrible acts in service to their dark gods. The corruption of dragons was another avenue of the old gods' influence. Deathwing was the most prominent example, but he was not alone. The infinite dragonflight, bronze dragons corrupted by the old gods' influence on time, worked to alter history in ways that would benefit their masters. The twilight dragonflight, created from eggs stolen from the other flights and infused with old god corruption, served as shock troops for the Twilight's hammer. The infinite dragonflight represented one of the old gods' most ambitious schemes. By corrupting the bronze dragons, who were charged with protecting the timeways, the old gods could potentially alter history itself. If key events could be changed, if the Titans could be prevented from ordering Azeroth, or if their prisons could be weakened before they were built, the old gods might achieve retroactive victory over enemies who had defeated them in the present. Murazond, the corrupted version of Nosdormu himself, led the infinite dragonflight. He had seen possible futures in which Azeroth fell to the void, and something in those visions had broken him. Rather than fight against those futures, Murazond came to believe that they were inevitable, that the only rational response was to embrace the coming darkness. His corruption showed that even the most powerful beings, even those blessed by Titans themselves, could fall to despair. The Twilight Dragonflight was a more direct creation, a new breed of dragon designed specifically to serve the old gods. Syntharia, consort of Deathwing, who was later known as Sinestra, oversaw the creation of these abominations. She combined eggs from all 5 dragonflights, infused them with old god corruption, and incubated them in dark chambers beneath grim battle. The resulting creatures were powerful but unstable, their mixed heritage creating unpredictable magical abilities. The Twilight Dragons possessed a connection to the void that natural dragons did not share. They could perceive and manipulate shadow energy directly, could phase between the physical world and the realm of nightmares. Their leaders, particularly the chromatic dragon Chromatus, who was created from the essence of all 5 dragonflights, were among the most dangerous creatures ever to threaten Azeroth. The dragons themselves understood what a terrible perversion the Twilight Flight represented. The 5 dragonflights, despite their differences and occasional conflicts, shared a common origin and a common purpose. To see that purpose corrupted, to watch dragons born specifically to destroy everything the flights had been created to protect, filled them with a horror that went beyond ordinary fear. It was as if the old gods had reached into the hearts of the dragons and twisted them from within. Even the Titan-forged, beings specifically created to combat the old gods, were not immune to corruption. Yogg-Saron's manipulation of Loken demonstrated that even these powerful beings could fall to the whispers from the dark. The curse of flesh, which transformed the Titan-forged into mortal creatures of meat and bone, was specifically designed to make them more susceptible to corruption. In the wake of Xal'atath's destruction, many believed that the threat of the old gods had finally ended, but there was still one piece of the puzzle that did not fit neatly into the story of the four old gods: Xal'atath, the entity known as the Blade of the Black Empire. Xal'atath was different from the old gods. The dagger that bore her name was forged during the height of the Black Empire, used for ritual sacrifices to the old gods. But the entity within the blade was not merely a servant of those ancient horrors. Recent revelations have suggested that Xal'atath is something older and stranger, a being whose true nature remains partially shrouded in mystery. According to some accounts, Xal'atath was originally a herald of Dimensius the All-Devouring, one of the legendary Void Lords who exist outside reality. If true, this would make her an emissary of the very beings who created the old gods in the first place. She traveled to Azeroth and found the four old gods attempting to corrupt its world soul. But rather than join them, Xal'atath opposed them. The reasons for this opposition remain unclear. Perhaps Xal'atath believed she could claim Azeroth's world soul for herself. Perhaps she served a different faction among the Void Lords. Perhaps she simply resented the power and position of the old gods. Whatever her motivations, Xal'atath launched an attack against Xal'atath shortly after the old god finished constructing Ny'alotha. The assault failed, and Xal'atath called upon the other old gods for aid, and together the four of them defeated Xal'atath's forces. Rather than destroying her, they imprisoned her within a dagger, the Blade of the Black Empire. This punishment was fitting in its cruelty. Xal'atath would be forced to watch as the old gods worked toward goals she had opposed. Unable to interfere, her power contained within a weapon that mortals would use for their own purposes. For tens of thousands of years, Xal'atath remained trapped in the blade, passed from hand to hand across history. The dagger always seemed to appear during moments of crisis and disaster, its influence subtly guiding events in ways that served unknown purposes. Those who wielded it heard whispers, insights, and secrets that the entity within chose to share. Shadow priests who used the blade as an artifact weapon during the Burning Legion's invasion received particularly detailed communications, with Xal'atath commenting on locations, enemies, and events with disturbing familiarity. During the events leading up to Xal'atath's release, Xal'atath was freed from the blade. The dagger was used to absorb the corruption of a dark gift from Xal'atath, and in the process, the entity within escaped into a new physical form. No longer bound to the weapon, Xal'atath began pursuing her own agenda once more. That agenda has become clearer in recent events. Xal'atath, and now calling herself the Harbinger of the Void, emerged as a major threat during the war within. She reached out to the Nerubians of Azj-Kahet, offering them power through the black blood of the old gods. Under her influence, some Nerubians transformed into creatures called the Ascended, powerful beings dedicated to Xal'atath's service. The implications of Xal'atath's actions are disturbing. While the old gods have been defeated or destroyed, the Void Lords who created them still exist beyond reality. If Xal'atath truly serves as a herald for Dimensius or another Void Lord, she may represent an even greater threat than the old gods themselves. The cosmic forces of the Void have not given up their desire to corrupt Azeroth's world soul. They have simply found a new agent to work toward that goal. Recent revelations have shown that Xal'atath's ultimate plan involves the Dark Heart, an artifact she has been empowering with various energies, including necrotic power from Galakrond, arcane energy from Dalaran, and void essence from Beladar. Her goal appears to be nothing less than claiming Azeroth's world soul for the Void, prying it from the influence of the Titans and transforming it into the Dark Titan that the Void Lords have always sought. The Nerubians of Ahn'qiraj, who had long resisted old god influence, proved vulnerable to Xal'atath's manipulations in ways they had never been to the imprisoned entities. Xal'atath offered them something the old gods never had: respect. She treated the Nerubians as allies rather than slaves, partners in a grand design rather than mere tools. Many found this approach compelling, especially those who had grown dissatisfied with the isolation and stagnation of their underground kingdom. The transformation into ascended Nerubians required consuming the black blood of the old gods, a substance that had been taboo in Nerubian society for millennia. Those who underwent the transformation gained tremendous power but lost something essential in the process. Their free will became subordinate to Xal'atath's designs, their personalities warped by the void energy coursing through their forms. The Ascended retained their intelligence and memories, but their priorities had been fundamentally altered. The spread of Xal'atath's influence through Ahn'qiraj demonstrated a key difference between her methods and those of the old gods. Where the old gods had demanded submission through fear and overwhelming power, Xal'atath offered partnership and advancement. She understood that willing servants were more effective than enslaved ones, that corruption worked best when the corrupted believed they were making their own choices. This made her influence insidious in ways the old gods had never managed. The ongoing conflict in Ahn'qiraj represents a new chapter in the eternal struggle between Azeroth and the Void. The old gods may be defeated, but the cosmic forces they served remain active. Xal'atath, whether as herald of Dimensius or as an independent agent with her own agenda, continues to work toward goals that would doom Azeroth just as surely as the old gods' plans would have. The victory over Xal'atath was not the end of the story, but merely the close of one chapter. The story of the old gods is, in many ways, the story of Azeroth itself. From the planet's earliest days, the struggle against void corruption has shaped events, influenced civilizations, and determined the fate of countless beings. Understanding this history provides context for everything that has happened on Azeroth and everything that may yet come to pass. The Titans arrived on Azeroth to find it already infected, already corrupted by entities that had been working toward its destruction for millions of years. The war they fought against the Black Empire was necessary, but insufficient. They could not destroy the old gods without destroying the planet, so they settled for imprisonment. This compromise ensured that the threat would never truly go away, that the corruption would persist in diminished but still dangerous forms. Every major conflict in Azeroth's history has been touched. by the old gods' influence in some way. The War of the Ancients, which brought the Burning Legion to Azeroth for the first time, was facilitated by the corruption of the Highborn and the manipulation of the dragon aspects. The sundering that followed created the conditions for Ashara's transformation and the rise of the Naga. The wars of the modern era have all been shaped by the lingering effects of old god corruption, from Deathwing's Cataclysm to the Shah of Pandaria to N'Zoth's assault on the world. Consider the first war between orcs and humans. This conflict is often attributed to the Burning Legion's manipulation of the orcs, and that is true as far as it goes. But the Legion's interest in Azeroth was partly driven by knowledge that the planet contained a world soul of unprecedented power, knowledge that the old god's corruption had made that world soul vulnerable. The demons sought to destroy Azeroth, specifically because the old gods had already begun weakening it. The Second War saw the rise of Gul'dan, the orc warlock who sought power at any cost. Gul'dan eventually betrayed the Horde to pursue the tomb of Sargeras, where he believed he would find ultimate power. What he found instead was death, as the demons within the tomb slaughtered him and his followers. But Gul'dan's ambition, his willingness to sacrifice anything for power, was exactly the kind of corruption that the old gods had always encouraged. Whether he knew it or not, he was following a pattern they had established millennia before. The Third War brought the Scourge and the Burning Legion to Azeroth simultaneously. The Lich King, created by the Legion from the soul of the orc shaman Ner'zhul, would prove to be one of the most devastating forces the world had ever faced. But the Lich King's power came partly from the Serenite used to construct his throne and his citadel, from the black blood of Yogg-Saron that whispered constantly to all who touched it. The old god's influence permeated the Scourge in ways that even the Lich King may not have fully understood. Even the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde, the war that has defined much of modern Azeroth's history, has been shaped by old god corruption. The distrust and hatred between the factions has been inflamed by agents of the old gods at key moments. Garrosh Hellscream's descent into tyranny was accelerated by his exposure to Y'Sharja's heart. Sylvanas Windrunner's increasingly erratic behavior during the Fourth War raised suspicions of outside influence that were never fully resolved. Time and again, when the mortal races might have found peace, something has emerged to drive them back into conflict. The mortal races of Azeroth have proven remarkably resilient in the face of this cosmic threat. Again and again, champions have risen to face the old gods and their servants. They have stormed the temple of ahn'qiraj and defeated C'Thun. They have descended into the depths of Ulduar and confronted Yogg-Saron. They have resisted the Shah in Pandaria and destroyed the heart of Y'Sharj. They have entered Ny'alotha itself and killed N'Zoth, something that the Titans themselves could not accomplish. But the threat is not over. Yogg-Saron still lurks in Ulduar, diminished but not destroyed. C'Thun's essence remains in ahn'qiraj. Xal'atath works toward goals that may be even more dangerous than those of the old gods she opposed. And beyond all of these immediate threats, the Void Lords continue to watch from outside reality, patient beyond imagining, waiting for their chance to claim what they have always sought. The nature of the old god's imprisonment raises troubling questions that have never been fully answered. Why did the Titans not find a way to destroy them safely? Why were the keepers, for all their power, ultimately unable to maintain the prisons without falling to corruption themselves? Why has each victory against the old gods felt incomplete, a temporary setback rather than a permanent solution? Some scholars suggest that the old gods cannot truly be destroyed because they have become part of Azeroth itself. Their tendrils reach too deep, their corruption is too widespread, their essence is too intertwined with the planet's own life force. Removing them completely would be like trying to remove a tree's roots without damaging the soil. The Titans recognized this, which is why they chose imprisonment over destruction. Others believe that the old gods serve some cosmic purpose that the Titans themselves did not fully understand. The universe is vast and strange, and beings like the Titans may not comprehend everything about how it works. Perhaps the old gods are somehow necessary, a counterbalance to forces of order that would otherwise become stagnant. This is a troubling theory that most champions of the light refuse to entertain, but it would explain why the old gods have proven so difficult to eliminate permanently. A third theory suggests that the old gods' apparent defeats are all part of a larger plan, one that spans not just millennia, but epochs. From this perspective, every battle fought against them, every seeming victory won, is merely a move in a game too complex for mortal minds to comprehend. The old gods knew they would be imprisoned, knew they would be diminished, knew that some of them would even be destroyed. But they also knew that the void is eternal, and that eventually, in some form, they or something like them would succeed. This theory is perhaps the most disturbing because it cannot be disproven. If the old gods' plans truly span eons, then any victory against them might be meaningless in the cosmic scale. Champions might believe they have won while actually playing into hands that were set in motion before their species even evolved. The only defense against such a possibility is continued vigilance, the refusal to ever declare final victory, the understanding that the struggle against the void must continue forever. The world soul of Azeroth, the nascent titan that the Void Lord sought to corrupt, still slumbers within the planet. It has been wounded by the old god's tendrils, scarred by the wars fought across its surface, and touched by darkness in ways that may not be fully healed. What kind of titan will eventually awaken from this damaged world soul? Will it be a champion of order, as the Pantheon hoped? Or will traces of void corruption persist, creating something new and unpredictable? The answers to these questions remain unknown. The story of the old gods is not truly finished. It is merely paused, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The void is eternal, and its hunger is endless. As long as Azeroth exists, as long as its world soul sleeps within, the threat of void corruption will persist. The old gods may be gone, but their legacy endures. There is a peculiar comfort in studying the old gods, despite the darkness of their story. Their tale reminds us that Azeroth has faced terrible threats before and survived them. It shows us that even the most overwhelming evil can be resisted, that even the most patient schemes can be disrupted, that even cosmic horrors can be defeated by those with the courage to stand against them. The old gods believed they were inevitable, that their victory was simply a matter of time. They were wrong. Their patience, which they considered infinite, ran out. Their schemes, which they believed perfect, were thwarted. Their power, which they thought insurmountable, was broken by champions they dismissed as insignificant. If there is a lesson to be drawn from their story, it is that despair is the enemy's greatest weapon, and hope is the defender's most potent shield. The mortal races of Azeroth have always been underestimated. The Titans saw them as lesser creations, byproducts of the curse of flesh, rather than beings of significance. The old gods viewed them as potential slaves, at best, obstacles to be corrupted or destroyed at worst. Even some of the mortal race's own leaders have doubted their ability to face cosmic threats. But again and again, when the situation seemed hopeless, when the darkness seemed absolute, champions have emerged to prove the doubters wrong. This pattern is not coincidence. Something within the mortal races of Azeroth gives them strength that defies expectation. Perhaps it is the influence of the world soul itself, lending power to those who fight for its protection. Perhaps it is the legacy of the Titans, who shaped these races with greater care than the old gods ever realized. Perhaps it is simply the nature of beings who live short lives and must therefore fight with everything they have for the time they possess. Whatever the source, this strength has been demonstrated too many times to be dismissed as luck. The future of Azeroth remains uncertain, but it is not predetermined. The old gods' prophecies of doom have not come true. The hour of twilight was averted, and Xal'atath was destroyed. Every time it seemed that the void would finally triumph, something intervened. This does not mean the future is safe. It simply means that the future is still being written, and those who fight for Azeroth still have the power to influence what that future will be. The defenders of Azeroth have won tremendous victories against impossible odds. They have proven that even cosmic horrors can be defeated, that darkness can be pushed back, that hope can persist in the face of overwhelming evil. These victories were not won by gods or titans, but by mortal beings who refused to surrender to despair. They are a testament to the strength that exists within the races of Azeroth, a reminder that even the smallest creature can make a difference in the cosmic struggle. But vigilance is eternal. The whispers from the void never truly stop. The temptation of power never fully fades. Each generation must be prepared to face the darkness anew, to stand against corruption wherever it emerges, to fight for the light even when all seems lost. This is the legacy of the struggle against the old gods, and it is the responsibility that falls upon all who call Azeroth home. The scars of the old gods' presence on Azeroth will never fully fade. In Xal'atath, the ruins of ahn'qiraj still pulse with residual corruption, and the Qiraji continue to lurk in the depths of their tunnels. In Northrend, Saronite deposits still whisper with Yogg-Saron's voice, driving mad those who work the mines too long. In Pandaria, the land remembers the Shah, and negative emotions can still give rise to smaller manifestations of the same dark forces. The corruption has been contained, not eliminated. Some argue that this is simply the nature of such ancient evils. The old gods existed for so long, touched so much of the world, that complete removal is impossible. Their influence has become part of Azeroth's identity, a darkness woven into the planet's very essence. Fighting against the old gods is not a battle that can be won in any final sense. It is a continuous struggle, a commitment to pushing back the darkness every day without ever expecting permanent victory. Others take a more hopeful view. They point to the defeat of Xal'atath, to the destruction of Y'Shaarj's heart, to the countless times that mortal champions have triumphed over seemingly invincible foes. They argue that the arc of Azeroth's history bends toward light, that each victory against the old gods has been more complete than the last. Perhaps, in time, even Yogg-Saron and S'thun can be fully eliminated. Perhaps the world soul itself is growing stronger, developing defenses against corruption that did not exist before. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The struggle against the void is eternal, but so is the capacity of Azeroth's defenders to rise to the challenge. The old gods underestimated mortal races for too long, viewing them as insects to be crushed or corrupted. That underestimation cost them everything. It is a lesson that the Void Lords themselves may need to learn if they ever send new agents to claim what the old gods failed to take. For now, Azeroth stands. Its defenders remain watchful. The world soul continues to grow and develop, moving toward an awakening that may change everything. What form it will take, what role the mortal races will play in its emergence, what challenges still lie ahead, these are questions for the future. The story of the old gods is part of Azeroth's past, a dark chapter that has been survived if not entirely closed. Whatever comes next will build upon what has been learned from that struggle. The night is quiet now. The whispers from the deep places have faded to near silence. The great prisons hold, their wards maintained by those who understand their importance. The champions who faced the old gods have moved on to other challenges, other threats, other stories. But they carry the memory of what they faced, and they remain ready to return if the darkness ever rises again. In the end, the story of the old gods is a story about Azeroth's soul, about the choice between corruption and purity, between surrender and resistance. The old gods represented everything that the void wanted to make of this world. They offered power without limit, knowledge without boundaries, strength without cost. All they asked in return was everything that made life worth living. Azeroth's defenders refused that bargain. They chose to fight for a world that was imperfect but their own, a world with limits and boundaries and costs, a world where strength came from unity rather than corruption. They chose hope over despair, light over darkness, life over the endless void. And they won. That choice is the true legacy of the struggle against the old gods. Not the victories, not the defeats, not the artifacts and the prisons and the scars left on the land. The legacy is the choice itself, the decision to stand against the darkness, no matter the odds. It is a choice that must be made again and again, by each generation, by each individual, every time the void whispers its terrible offers. As long as that choice is made, the old gods have truly lost. Not because they were destroyed, though some were. Not because they were imprisoned, though others remain bound. They lost because they could not break the spirit of those who opposed them. They offered everything, and Azeroth's defenders said no. That refusal echoes through history, a reminder that some things cannot be corrupted, some bonds cannot be broken, some light cannot be extinguished. The planet endures, the world soul dreams, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Void Lords wait, patient as ever, for their next opportunity to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. But they will find, as their servants found before them, that Azeroth does not surrender easily. This world has faced the worst that the Void could send, and it still stands. it will continue to stand, protected by those who choose to defend it. That is the complete story of the Old Gods. If you found this dark corner of Warcraft lore as fascinating as I do, hit like and subscribe. There is much more ancient and unsettling history from Azeroth waiting for you here on World of Sleepcraft.